You won't see us again. We're finally free. Shoo!
Just leave us alone for good!
Three cold-hearted children just decided to throw their own parents away like everyday garbage. Like they were absolutely nothing. They left Rose and Anthony out there on a lonely stretch of road in the blazing, burning heat with literally nothing but the clothes on their backs. Not a dime, not a bottle of water, just the clothes they were wearing. "You're a burden we can't take anymore," they said, looking right at them. Then they drove away in their shiny black Mercedes, and they never even looked back. Not once. But those three ungrateful children really had no idea what they had just thrown away. Hello, friends, and welcome to our story today. We are so glad you're here with us. Before we dive into everything, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps a lot. Also, tell us down in the comments where you are watching from today. Are you in New York, Canada, maybe South Africa, or Jamaica? We really want to know where our community is at. Let's get into it. Rose woke up that morning, and the very first thing she felt was a deep, terrible heaviness sitting right in the middle of her chest. It was just sitting there. Heavy. It wasn't the kind of sharp pain that comes from a physical sickness or a bad heart or anything like that. No, after 70 long years of living and breathing on this earth, she knew the difference between a body that was hurting and a soul that was just completely exhausted. This feeling right here, this was the second kind. It was that slow, creeping feeling you get when you finally realize that the place you have called your home for decades doesn't want you living inside its walls anymore. She lay there perfectly still for a long moment. She just kept her eyes locked on the ceiling above her, watching the early morning shadows play across the cracked paint. The house was quiet, sure, but it was not a peaceful kind of quiet. Not at all. It was the kind of heavy quiet that sits right on top of all the things people leave unsaid. A pressing, heavy silence that just waits for the other shoe to drop. Beside her in the bed, Anthony was still sleeping. His chest rose and fell. His breathing was slow and just a little bit rough, exactly the way it had been ever since his heart started giving him real trouble a while back. She turned her head slowly on the pillow and looked at him. She looked at his messy white hair. She looked at the deep lines carved all over his face. Those lines told the whole entire story of his life, if a person just knew how to read them right. There were the good lines from years of loud laughter. There were the deep lines from worry and stress. Lines from years and years of hard, back-breaking work and getting up before the sun. Lines from all those sleepless, scary nights when the children were small and sick with fevers and just needed someone to hold them until the morning came. She reached out her hand. Her fingers were a little shaky. She touched his gray hair very gently, making sure she wouldn't wake him from his rest. "How do we get here, my love?" She whispered into the quiet room. She really wanted to know. He didn't hear her, of course. He just kept breathing, slow and rough, in and out. Rose finally got up from the bed. Getting out of bed was always a process these days. Every single movement was its own small battle to fight. Her knees ached, her back felt tight, and her hands were stiff in the chilly morning air. She moved slowly through the bedroom, her feet sliding over the floorboards. She walked past the old framed wedding photo hanging on the wall. She stopped to look at it for a second. The two of them in the picture, young and bright-eyed, smiling at the camera like the whole wide world was just a beautiful gift waiting to be opened. Then she walked out into the narrow hallway. When she got to the kitchen, she did exactly what she had done every single morning for 50 years. She cooked. She didn't stand there, cooking because anyone had politely asked her to. She didn't do it out of obligation. She cooked because at this point in her life, it was the only language she had left that still felt like love. She pulled out the old pan. She cracked 3 eggs into it, doing it very carefully because eggs were definitely not cheap right now. She put 2 slices of bread in the toaster and turned on the stove to put water on to boil for their morning tea. 3 eggs for 5 grown people. She was already doing the math in her head, calculating. She decided she would give Anthony 2 of the eggs. He needed the extra strength for his medicine. She would just take half of the last one for herself. That would be enough for her. She didn't need much. She was still standing there by the stove, watching the eggs sizzle, when Sandra appeared right in the kitchen doorway. Sandra was 42 years old now and worked downtown as an accountant. She was still wearing her fuzzy robe, and her hair was not brushed yet. But her face, her expression was already fully awake. It was sharp and cold and totally ready to find fault with absolutely something. She stood there and looked at the stove. She looked at the pan. She looked right at the 3 eggs cooking in the oil. "Mom," she said, and her voice had that tone. It was that specific tone. The tone Rose had been hearing more and more these days from her kids. The tone that made a 70-year-old woman feel like a little child who was being scolded. "Those eggs again," Sandra sighed loudly. "Do you have any idea how much money we spend on food in this house every month?" Rose didn't look up. She kept her eyes glued to the pan. "I thought you might want something to eat before you head to work," she said very quietly. "I eat on the street," Sandra snapped. "It's cheaper." Sandra walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up a thick stack of papers. Rose could see they were medical bills, held tightly together with a thick rubber band. Sandra dropped the stack onto the wooden kitchen table. It made a hard, flat smack sound that echoed in the room. "These came to mail yesterday," Sandra said. "Dad's prescriptions again." Rose did not turn to look at the papers. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly what was inside those envelopes. She took a spatula and turned the eggs over very carefully so the yolks wouldn't break. "3 eggs, Mom." Sandra's voice was getting even sharper now. Louder. "3 eggs, and you're just standing there cooking like you're trying to feed a whole restaurant. Every single day is always something with you, too. The electricity bill, the water, the expensive medication, the grocery food." She grabbed the edges of her robe and pulled it tighter around her body, shaking her head like she was the victim. "I'm exhausted." "We are all just exhausted." Rose didn't argue. She slid the cooked eggs onto a clean plate. Her hands were perfectly steady. Over many long years of hardship, she had learned how to keep her hands steady on the outside, even when everything inside her chest was trembling and falling apart. "Sit down," Rose said softly, gesturing to the chair. "Please, just eat something. I told you I eat on the." Sandra started to complain again. Rose turned around. She finally looked right at her daughter. Just for a brief moment. Just long enough to let the heavy moment be exactly what it was. "Sit down and eat something, please," Rose repeated. Sandra stopped. She looked at her mother's tired, lined face. Something quick flickered across Sandra's own face. Something that might have been a tiny bit of guilt, or maybe it was just annoyance. Honestly, it was getting really hard to tell with Sandra these days. But she sat down at the table. She pulled the warm plate toward her. She started eating the eggs without even saying thank you. Her eyes went straight down her phone, her fingers scrolling quickly through something on the screen that was apparently way more interesting than the older woman who had given birth to her and raised her. Rose quietly made Anthony's plate and carried it slowly back down the hall to the bedroom. Anthony was fully awake now. He was sitting up slowly against the pillows, his hand reaching out automatically for the pill bottles resting on the little bedside table. Rose walked in and set the plate of food gently in front of him. Then she sat down right on the edge of the mattress. She sat there and watched him take his morning pill with a sip of water. She watched him look down at his breakfast. 2 eggs and a piece of toast and a small, warm cup of tea. He looked back up at her. He had known this woman for 50 whole years. He could read the expressions on her face way better than he could read the words in any book. "What did she say to you?" he asked, his voice a little gruff. "Nothing important," Rose said, trying to smile. He looked at her closely for a long, silent moment. He wasn't fooled. Then he looked back down at his plate. He picked up his metal fork. "Rose," he started to say quietly. "Eat," she told him gently. "Just eat while it's still hot." So he ate his food. She sat right there beside him on the bed. And out there, just outside their closed bedroom door, the rest of the house started to move around them. It was waking up. They could hear Sandra's hard shoes clicking loudly on the kitchen floor. They heard the big television turning on in the living room, which meant Benjamin was already awake and, as usual, already doing absolutely nothing. Then came the familiar sound of Robert's car, tires pulling into the gravel driveway. Robert had his own nice apartment clear across town. There was absolutely no particular reason for him to be visiting this early in the morning. No reason at all. except for the one reason that Rose was slowly starting to understand in her gut. Something bad was coming. She could feel it in her bones, the exact same way a person can feel a rainstorm in the air long before the first drop even falls. It was a heavy pressure in the air, a stillness that was not peaceful at all, but waiting, just waiting to strike. She folded her wrinkled hands together in her lap, and she didn't say a single word. And Anthony just ate his 2 eggs and pretended he wasn't sitting there listening to the low voices that were starting to gather right outside their bedroom door. Robert didn't even knock when he came in. He just didn't knock anymore. This was a painful thing Rose had started to notice lately. The slow, steady disappearance of all the small, normal courtesies. First, they stopped knocking on doors. Then, they stopped saying good morning. Then it escalated to not asking before taking things out of the refrigerator, not asking before changing the television channel, and eventually making big decisions about a house that wasn't even legally theirs. Robert walked straight into the bedroom. Rose was sitting there on the bed, and Anthony was still holding his fork over his plate. Robert just stood right in the doorway. He had his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked at both of his parents with a weird expression on his face that Rose could not quite put a name to. It wasn't exactly an unkind look, but surely was not kind either. It was something stuck in the middle, something that felt way worse than either of those things. "We need to talk," Robert said flatly. "All of us. Out in the living room. Now." Anthony slowly set his fork down on the plate. "I am eating my breakfast," he said. "It won't take long," Robert insisted. Rose quickly put her hand on Anthony's arm. It was just a small touch, a tiny physical signal that passed between the two of them in half a second. It meant, "Let's just go. It's easier. Don't fight him on this." Anthony understood it perfectly. He always understood her. He let out a sigh and set his plate over on the bedside table. There was still half of his food sitting on it. He slowly reached down for his wooden walking stick. The living room felt totally different with all 5 of them standing and sitting in it. Or maybe Rose thought it had always felt this crowded and tense, and she was only just now seeing it for what it clearly was. Robert stood up tall near the front window, trying to look in charge. Sandra had moved from the kitchen table and was now sitting tightly in the nice armchair, her big pile of bills and papers resting on her lap. Benjamin was lounging on the soft sofa. He was still wearing his messy pajamas. He had this very particular look on his face, the look of someone who already knows exactly what is about to be said and has already decided he is perfectly fine with it. Rose and Anthony walked in and sat down together on the smaller sofa, pushed up against the back wall. This small sofa used to be right in the center of the room, until Robert had come over one weekend and completely rearranged all their furniture without even asking them first. "Okay," Robert said loudly. He cleared his throat to get attention. "So, we have all been talking lately." "When?" Anthony asked, looking right at him. Robert paused, clearly caught off guard. "Sorry? When did you all do this talking?" Anthony asked again. His voice was very calm and very low, "Because I certainly didn't hear any of this talking happening in my house." A quick look passed between the 3 siblings. It was quick and small and almost invisible to a normal person. But Rose caught it. She saw it. She had spent 50 long years watching people's faces change. She caught every little thing. "We've been discussing things for a while now," Sandra chimed in smoothly. "Just among ourselves. Because we didn't want to worry you guys until we had a solid plan in place." "A plan?" Anthony repeated the word slowly. "Yes," Robert nodded slowly. He did that thing he always did when he was trying to keep himself very, very calm and professional. "What kind of plan are we talking about?" Rose asked, her voice shaking just a tiny bit. Sandra opened her thick folder. Of course, she had a folder ready. Sandra literally always had a folder for everything. Rose thought, not for the first time in her life, that her middle child had probably been born holding a file folder in her little hands. "I have been going through all the household numbers," Sandra began, using her business voice. "And I just want to be totally honest with you both. Because I think honesty is very important in a family." Honesty, Rose thought to herself. Yes, let's talk about honesty. "The current situation here is just not sustainable anymore," Sandra continued. "Dad's heart medication alone is costing $200 a month. The electricity bill has gone way up because you keep turning on the space heater. The grocery bill is significantly higher than it really should be for a house this size. And the maintenance. I built this house, Anthony interrupted her. His voice was getting louder. Dad, please, Sandra started. With my own bare hands, Anthony said. He held his hands up in the air for them to see. They were big, rough, trembling hands. These hands built this place. 3 whole years. Working every single weekend. I know that, Dad, Robert said, stepping forward. And nobody is trying to take that away from you. But things are different now. Times have changed. We all have our own expenses now, our own busy lives. And the honest reality of the situation is, Robert paused. And right in that short pause, Rose heard everything that was coming next. She heard it exactly the way a person hears the deep rumble of thunder before the bright lightning strikes. Not the bad thing itself, but the dark warning of it rolling right toward you across the open sky. We found a place for you. Robert finally finished his sentence. A nice care facility. It's not too far from here. It is very clean. They have a professional staff. There are lots of other people your own age there. You would get to have your own private room. All your meals will be taken care of for you. There is medical support right on site for Dad's heart condition. A nursing home, Anthony said flatly. A care facility, Robert corrected quickly. A nursing home, Anthony repeated. His voice was very quiet now, almost a whisper. Now, say what it actually is, Robert. The entire living room went completely still. Nobody moved. Benjamin looked down at the carpet. Sandra looked down at her messy papers. Robert looked right at his old father. And for just a tiny moment, just one very small flicker in time, something moved across Robert's face that really might have been shame. But then, as quickly as it came, it was totally gone. It is simply the best option we have, Robert said coldly. For everyone involved. Rose did not cry. She didn't let a single tear fall. She had promised herself a very long time ago that she would never, ever cry in front of them again. Not because she was too full of pride, but because she understood deep down in her gut that her tears would not soften their hard hearts. Some people in this world are moved by crying. These 3 people sitting here, she finally understood, were not. So she just sat there on the small sofa. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she looked at her grown children. She really, truly looked at them one by one. She stared into their faces, and she tried to find the small, sweet children she had carried in her body and fed with a spoon and stayed up with through the dark nights. The kids she had loved with every single thing she had inside her. She could still find tiny pieces of them hidden there. Robert's square jaw was the exact same shape it had been when he was 10 years old playing in the yard. Sandra still had her lovely grandmother's green eyes. Benjamin, even right now, even acting like this, had a gentle softness around his mouth that he had been born with as a baby. But the real children themselves, the ones she had known and raised, they seemed to have packed up and gone somewhere else. They had been replaced, gradually and completely without her even noticing it happening, by these 3 cold strangers. Strangers who looked at their mother and saw nothing but a negative number on a budget page. When she finally asked a question, Robert looked almost relieved that she wasn't yelling and arguing. We have already spoken to the management there, Robert told her. They could take both of you by the end of this week. Already spoken to them. So, the big decision was already made. It had been made long before this fake conversation even began. This was clearly not a family discussion. This was an eviction notification. Rose nodded her head once. All right, she said softly. Anthony turned his head and looked at her sharply. She could feel his angry eyes burning right on her face. But she did not look back at him. Not yet. All right, Benjamin echoed, and he actually sounded genuinely surprised. He sounded like he had fully expected a huge fight and was almost disappointed not to get some drama. All right, Rose said again. She placed her hands on her knees, and she stood up. She carefully smoothed down the front of her simple dress. She turned around and walked straight back to the kitchen. She went to the sink, and she finished washing the dirty dishes from breakfast. She did not make a single sound while she did it. It was much later in the day. Much later, after Robert had finally gone back to his apartment, and Sandra had left for her accountant job, and lazy Benjamin had gone right back to sleep on the sofa. That was when Rose finally went out to the small backyard to hang the wet laundry on the line. The backyard was quite small but nice. Anthony had planted a little lemon tree right in the middle of it many years ago, back when the children were still young and running around. It was a really big tree now. It spread its green branches out over half of the yard, and every summer, it gave them way more fresh lemons than they could ever possibly use. Rose used to make big pitchers of sweet lemonade and leave it out on the front step for the neighborhood kids to drink. She was standing there, pinning wet sheets to the line, when she heard the voices talking. She went completely still, like a statue. The small kitchen window was wide open to let in the breeze. Sandra had come back home. Maybe it was her lunch break, or maybe she had just forgotten some important folder. But she was in the kitchen talking to Benjamin, who was apparently awake after all. Rose did not move an inch. She just stood there. She held a cold, wet sheet tightly in her hands, and she listened to them talk. "Did you call them back yet?" Sandra was saying. "Yeah," Benjamin answered lazily. "Friday morning. They're going to send a transport van to pick them up." "Good," Sandra said. "In their bedroom. I'm going to start clearing all that stuff out this weekend." "Awesome," Benjamin said. Then came the sound of the refrigerator door opening and closing. "Do you think they'll actually stay there at the nursing home?" Benjamin asked while chewing something. "Or do you think they'll try to come back here?" "They will not come back," Sandra said. Her voice was totally flat and so certain, completely without any doubt in the world. "I will personally make sure of it." "And the house?" There was a longer pause this time in the kitchen. "The house is ours now," Sandra said firmly. "It always should have been ours anyway. They are way too old to do anything useful with it. We will just sort out the legal side of things once they are fully settled at the home. Robert is okay with that plan. Actually, Robert is the one who suggested it." Benjamin laughed. It was a short, low, very comfortable laugh. It was the laugh of a person who has just gotten away with stealing something valuable. "What about Mom's old stuff in the bedroom?" Benjamin asked. "All those dusty boxes. We will deal with it." Sandra brushed it off. "Most of it is just useless junk anyway." The refrigerator door closed again. Heavy footsteps moved away from the open window, and Rose just stood there in the warm backyard. She was holding a wet white sheet right beside the lemon tree that Anthony had planted. Standing under the big blue sky they had all shared as a family for 30 long years. And now, only right now, completely alone in the yard where nobody at all could see her face, she finally let herself cry. Not for very long, just for a quick minute. Just long enough to let the sharp, burning pain move through her chest and out of her body, so she could start to think clearly again. Then she lifted her hands and wiped her wet face with the rough hem of her cooking apron. She hung the white sheet on the clothesline. She reached into the basket and picked up the next wet one. There was still laundry that needed to be done today. That evening, when the sun went down, Rose told Anthony everything she had heard. She waited patiently until the house was noisy enough that no one would overhear them talking. Benjamin had his television turned up loud down the hall. Sandra was talking loudly on a phone call in her bedroom. Robert had gone back to his apartment across town. Then she sat down on the edge of the mattress beside Anthony. She told him quietly and very carefully everything she had heard through the open kitchen window that afternoon. He sat there and listened to her without interrupting her even once. That was highly unusual for him. Anthony was definitely not a man who ever listened quietly to bad news. His whole entire life, he had been the kind of strong man who stood right up, who pushed back hard, who used his big rough hands and his loud, booming voice to fight for the things that mattered to his family. Rose had always loved that fiery part of him, but she had also, over the many years, spent a considerable amount of energy trying to calm him down when he got too hot. But tonight was different. Tonight, he just sat there and listened to her words. And when she finally finished the story, he was quiet for a very, very long time. The small lamp on the bedside table was turned on. It was casting a warm, soft yellow light over both of their tired faces. Outside the bedroom window, the big city was making its normal nighttime sounds. The rush of distant traffic, someone playing loud music down the block, the sharp bark of a dog 2 streets over. Normal, everyday sounds. Life was just going on outside. "The house," Anthony finally said, breaking the silence. "Yes," Rose nodded. "They want to keep the house." That is what Sandra said to him. He looked down at his big hands resting in his lap. Those same hands that had mixed the heavy concrete and carried the red bricks and hammered the sharp nails for 3 whole years to build the solid walls around them. He turned his hands over slowly, looking at his palms like they belonged to some stranger he used to know a long time ago. "I see," he said, and those 2 simple words, spoken so incredibly softly, broke Rose's heart far more completely than any loud, angry argument ever could have done. She had fully expected him to be furious. Anger she could have handled easily. Anger was something familiar to her. It was loud and hot, but it always burned itself out eventually, just like a fire does. She knew exactly how to sit in a room with Anthony's anger. She knew how to wait for it to pass by. She knew how to be right there waiting on the other side of it. But this right here was not anger. This was something much quieter and infinitely more terrible. This was a proud man understanding, fully and finally, that the children he had given everything in his life to had looked at everything he built and coldly decided it was worth a lot more money without him living in it. "Anthony," she whispered, "I'm all right. You really don't have to pretend to be all right." He turned and looked at her, and she saw it right then. She saw the heavy thing he was working very, very hard to hold inside. His chest. It moved right there behind his tired eyes, looking exactly like water trapped behind a sheet of glass. "What do we do now?" she asked him. He was quiet again. The bedside lamp flickered just once slightly, and then it steadied itself. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing at all. We just let them do what they're going to do." He said the words slowly, like he was trying to work the math out in his head as he spoke. "We do not fight them. We do not argue with them. We just go." Rose stared at him in shock. "Anthony, please. I'm tired," Rose interrupted gently. And he said the word tired in a way that meant way more than just being sleepy tonight. It meant way more than just this past hard week. He said it in a way that meant decades of being tired. "I'm just too tired to fight people who have already made up their minds. And I absolutely do not want to spend whatever short amount of time I have left on this earth arguing with my own children inside my own house." He reached over the blanket and took her soft hand in his. "So we go," he said firmly, "and we hold our heads up high when we walk out that door. And we absolutely do not give them the sick satisfaction of seeing us beg to stay." Rose looked deeply at this old man she had loved so much for 50 years. She thought that even right now, even right here in this awful situation, even looking like this, he was still the absolute finest person she had ever known in her life. "Okay," she whispered back. "Okay," he said, and they just sat there together in the warm lamplight, holding hands tightly, while all around them, the solid house that Anthony had built settled into its dark nighttime quiet. Friday morning came way too quickly. Rose spent the slow days before it doing what she literally always did. She was cooking, cleaning, wiping counters, and moving through the house with her quiet, invisible efficiency. But now, there was a completely different quality to the way she moved. She was really paying attention to things, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do before. She noticed the exact way the early morning light came shining through the kitchen window and made a bright pale rectangle on the linoleum floor. She noticed the particular creaking sound the third stair made when you stepped on it. She noticed the sweet smell of the lemon tree drifting in through the back door on the warm breeze. She was actively memorizing her home. She didn't pack very much at all, just one small bag for each of them, a few changes of clothes, their important identification papers, Anthony's heart medication bottles, the framed wedding photo taken down from the wall, and a small, worn Bible that had belonged to Rose's mother, its old cover worn as soft as human skin from years and years of daily handling. Sandra stood there and watched her pack the bags. She watched with the careful, scanning eyes of someone making absolutely sure nothing extra or valuable was being taken from the room. She didn't actually say this out loud, of course. She just stood there leaning in the doorway of the bedroom, making fake small talk about the weather outside and the city traffic. And all the while she talked, her eyes moved constantly over Rose's open bag, counting and assessing every item. Rose just zipped the bag closed and said nothing. The transport van arrived right at 9 o'clock in the morning. 2 workers wearing matching blue uniforms got out. They were perfectly polite and professional. They were exactly the kind of people who had clearly done this sad job many, many times before, and they had learned how to be gentle and quiet about it. One of the men picked up Anthony's bag. The other man kindly offered Rose his arm to help her down the front steps. Robert was standing there. Sandra was standing there. Even Benjamin had somehow managed to get dressed in real clothes, which honestly felt to Rose like its own kind of weird comment on the special occasion. They all stood together on the front concrete path, and they performed the fake scene that Rose had known all along they would perform. The stiff hugs, the fake reassurances, the empty promises. "We will come visit you every single week," Robert said smoothly, leaning in to hug his mother. His arms felt stiff as boards around her shoulders, but his voice sounded warm and caring. The jarring combination of those two opposite things was almost more painful than getting no hug at all. "Of course we will come," Sandra agreed, nodding her head. She squeezed Rose's hand briefly. Her long fingers were icy cool. Benjamin leaned in and hugged Anthony. And right over his son's shoulder, Anthony's eyes met Rose's eyes. Just for a brief second, just long enough to silently say, "I see this too. I see exactly what this fake show is." Then Anthony stepped back and straightened his back up. He stood as tall and proud as his old, tired body would allow him to stand. He reached down and picked up his own small bag, even though the young man in the blue uniform was reaching for it. He walked straight over to the van under his own power. Rose stopped and looked at the green front door one last time. It was chipped and slightly faded by the sun. It was still that very particular shade of bright green that Anthony had specifically chosen 30 years ago because it reminded him of his childhood home. She stared at it. Then she turned away. She got into the van. She did not look back. The Sunrise Care Facility was a 40-minute drive clear across the busy city. Rose sat silently and watched the city streets go zooming by through the tinted van window. The city moved so fast around them. People were walking fast on the sidewalks. Cars were pressing close together in traffic. Shops were opening their doors for the morning rush. Everyone out there was going somewhere. Everyone had somewhere important to be, except for them. Anthony sat right beside her on the vinyl seat. He held his wooden walking stick resting between his knees. He looked quietly out his own window. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left the driveway. She reached over and took his rough hand. He gripped her fingers tightly, much more tightly than she had expected him to. She held on tight. The facility was a low, wide brick building painted the color of old cream. There was a small, sad-looking garden out front with a few concrete benches and a few rose bushes that were way past their blooming season. The plastic sign hung above the sliding glass door was bright blue and falsely cheerful, featuring a small cartoon drawing of a smiling sun in the corner. Inside the lobby, it smelled heavily of strong cleaning fluid. And then there was something else underneath the cleaning fluid, a stale smell that the cleaning fluid was obviously trying very hard to cover up. The linoleum floors were shiny and buffed. The overhead lights were painfully bright, and everything looked very, very clean in a way that felt much more like a hospital clinical setting than a welcoming home. A nurse holding a plastic clipboard took their names at the front desk. Another nurse walked them down the long hallway to show them to their room. The room was very small. There were two narrow, identical beds pushed against the walls. There was one window overlooking the flat, gray asphalt of the car park. They had to share a bathroom located all the way down the hall. There was a small television mounted on a metal bracket on the wall and a small square table with two hard wooden chairs. Meals are served exactly at 7, 12, and 6 o'clock, the nurse explained, smiling a practiced smile. There's a large common room down at the end of the hall. We have group activities scheduled most afternoons. If you need absolutely anything at all, you just press that red button right by the bed. She turned and left them alone. Rose and Anthony stood right in the middle of the small square room and just looked around at it. Then Rose slowly sat down on the very edge of one of the narrow beds. She pressed her hand down firmly on the mattress. It was thin and hard. She looked out the square window at the gray car park. Anthony sat down heavily on the other bed. He carefully set his wooden walking stick against the blank wall. He folded his big hands in his lap. "Well," he said quietly. "Well," said Rose. Right outside in the long hallway, they could hear someone crying. It was not loudly. It was just the quiet, steady, rhythmic crying of someone who had clearly been doing it for a very long time and had almost stopped noticing they were even making the sound. Down at the far end of the hall, a very old man was sitting completely alone in the common room. He was sitting in a chair facing the main door, just watching every single person who passed by with desperate, hopeful eyes. He was still sitting there watching the door when Rose finally looked away and closed her own door. The very first night was absolutely the hardest. Rose lay flat on her back in the narrow, hard bed. She stared up at the blank ceiling tiles and just listened to all the strange sounds of the place. It was never fully quiet here. Never. There was always some kind of noise happening. A heavy door clicking open somewhere down the wing. A distant television mumbling the late-night news. The soft, squeaking footsteps of a night nurse doing her scheduled rounds in the dark. The occasional sudden cry or low moan coming from somewhere down the hall that would start up suddenly out of nowhere and then just stop, exactly like a machine being switched off. And underneath all of those sounds, there was always that quiet, steady crying. Still going on. Patient and endless, just like falling rain. She slowly turned her head on the thin pillow and looked across the small, dark gap between the two narrow beds. Anthony was lying flat on his back, too. His eyes were wide open. He was staring straight up at the exact same ceiling tiles. "Can't sleep?" she whispered. Into the dark. "No," he whispered back. She reached her hand out across the empty gap between the beds. He immediately reached his hand back toward hers. Their fingers finally found each other in the dark space. "It won't always feel like this," she whispered softly, even though she wasn't at all sure she actually believed what she was saying. "No," he agreed softly, though she could easily tell from his voice that he wasn't sure he believed it, either. They just lay there like that for a very long while, holding hands tightly across the gap, until eventually Anthony's rough breathing started to slow down and deepen. She knew then that he was finally, thankfully, asleep. She let go of his hand very carefully so as not to wake him up. She folded her own hands over her chest. She did not fall asleep for a very, very long time. The passing days at Sunrise Care Facility quickly developed a rigid shape to them. Breakfast was served at exactly 7 o'clock. It was usually bland porridge or watery eggs, served in the large, echoing dining room. The room was filled with round tables where elderly men and women sat and mostly ate their food in complete silence. Some of the lucky ones had visitors show up on the weekends, but most of them did not. They just moved slowly through the facility with the careful, shuffling movements of people who had finally learned that there was absolutely no point in hurrying anywhere because nothing good was coming that needed to be hurried toward. Rose tried very hard to learn their names. That was just how she was built. She had always strongly believed that learning and knowing a person's name was the absolute first small act of human respect you could offer them. There was a lady named Margaret who had been a strict school teacher for years and still carried herself like one, sitting up very straight. There was old Henry, the man who always sat in the common room chair watching the door. It turned out he actually had a truly wonderful, lying, booming laugh once you finally got him talking about his old garden. And there was a tiny, frail woman called Dorothy. She sat right by the front window every single afternoon and just looked out at the parking lot with an expression of absolute, intense concentration, exactly as though she was expecting a car to pull in to get her at any given second. Dorothy's daughter had brought her to this place 6 months ago. She had never come back to visit. Not once. But Dorothy was still sitting there, waiting. A whole week passed by. No phone calls from Robert. No phone calls from Sandra. Absolutely nothing from Benjamin. Rose honestly had not expected the calls to come. Not really anyway. But there's a huge, painful difference between logically not expecting something to happen and actually experiencing the cold, hard absence of it in real life. Every single time she walked past the plastic phone mounted on the hallway wall, she felt it. It was a tiny, involuntary spike of hope in her chest, followed immediately by a quiet, crushing disappointment when it didn't ring. She forced herself to stop looking at the phone entirely after the 5th day. Anthony noticed this. He noticed everything she did, even now, even with his failing health being the way it was. He quietly watched his wife move around through this new, horribly small life. And he saw all the hidden places where the pain lived inside her. He saw the slight, stiffening jerk of her shoulders whenever she had to walk past the hallway phone. He saw the exact way she looked at the other residents who were lucky enough to be visiting with their families on Sunday afternoons. She looked at them with a sad expression that she thought nobody else could see. But he could see it perfectly, and seeing it made him grow quieter and quieter with each passing day. On the morning of the 8th day, Rose came back to the room from breakfast to find Anthony still lying in bed. He was out on his side, facing the blank wall. His breakfast tray, which a young staff member had brought directly to the room, was sitting totally untouched on the small table. "Anthony," she said softly. "Nothing." He didn't move. "Anthony, please sit up. You really need to eat something." "I'm not hungry," he mumbled to the wall. She walked over and sat down on the edge of his narrow bed. She put her warm hand gently on his arm. Right through his thin, cotton pajama sleeve, she could easily feel exactly how much weight he had already lost in just one short week. She had noticed it happening at breakfast time, too. He barely ate anything anymore. He just pushed the bland food around on his plate with his fork and stared blankly at the table. "Look at me," she said firmly. He turned over very slowly. His face looked gray and incredibly tired. "You have to eat food," she told him. "Your heart medication does not work right on an empty stomach. You already know that. What does it even matter anymore?" He said quietly, and the way he said it wasn't a question. It was something much worse than a question. It was a flat, dull statement, completely empty of any fight at all. Rose looked closely at her husband's tired face, and she felt a sudden, freezing fear move right through her veins. It was totally different from all the other fears she had ever carried in her long life. This was not the normal fear of poverty or physical illness or losing a home. This was the raw, terrifying fear of watching someone you love slowly disappear right in front of your eyes while they're still sitting right there. She reached over and picked up the plastic fork from his untouched breakfast tray. "Open your mouth right now," she ordered. "Anthony James, open your mouth." He looked at her eyes, and something in her voice, some fierce firmness, some stubborn refusal to just accept what was happening to him, finally reached through the fog in his brain. He slowly pushed himself up against the pillows. He reached out and took the fork from her shaking hand. He ate the food, but she knew in her heart it was not nearly enough. That same afternoon, while Anthony was taking a long nap, Rose sat out in the common room with Margaret, the retired school teacher, and she finally let herself think clearly and logically about their awful situation for the exact first time since they had arrived at the facility. They simply could not stay here. It wasn't because the building was terrible. The staff members were kind enough to everyone. The meals were adequate to keep a body alive. Her own body was managing the routine just fine. But Anthony was fading away. She could actually see it happening in real time, exactly like a wax candle burning all the way down to nothing. He desperately needed fresh air and a real purpose and his dignity. He needed to feel like he was a man again and not just a broken problem that had been filed away in a sterile room. Every single day spent inside these cream-colored walls was slowly taking something vital away from him, and she was not at all sure she could ever get it back for him. "You are thinking very hard over there," Margaret observed from across the puzzle table. Rose looked up quickly. The older teacher was watching her face with sharp, kind, observant eyes. "Am I really that obvious?" Rose asked, trying to smile. "Only to someone who has been sitting here doing the exact same kind of thinking," Margaret replied smoothly. She folded her neat hands on the tabletop. "How long have you been here now?" 8 days, Rose answered. Margaret nodded her head slowly. "It gets easier," she said softly. Then she paused and corrected herself. "Or, well, you just get more used to it. I am honestly not sure those two things are the same thing." "How long have you been here?" Rose asked her. 14 months, Margaret replied. She said it completely without any particular emotion in her voice. Exactly the way you state a boring fact about the weather outside. Rose sat quiet for a second. "My son is the one who brought me here," Margaret continued sharing. He told me it was just temporary, just for a little bit, while he sorted some personal things out of home. She turned her head and looked out the window at the dying rose bushes. Well, he sorted things out all right. He never came back for me. The two women just sat there with that heavy truth hanging between them for a long moment. I'm so sorry, Rose finally said gently. Don't be sorry for me, said Margaret, waving a hand. Save it for yourself. You're going to need it a lot more than I do. She calmly picked up her plastic cup of hot tea. The new people who just arrived always have that same look on their faces, like they're still just waiting to wake up from a bad dream. Does the look ever go away? Rose asked. Margaret considered this question very seriously, exactly the way a good teacher considers a smart question that deserves a real, honest answer. The look does go away eventually, she said finally. But whether that is actually a good thing or not really depends entirely on the person. That night, Anthony couldn't sleep again. But this time, he was the one who reached his hand across the dark gap between the beds first. Rose, he whispered out into the darkness. I'm here, she whispered back. I want to leave this place, he said firmly. She lay perfectly quiet. I know we have nowhere else to go, he continued. I know my heart is sick. I know it doesn't make any logical sense. His voice was low and very deliberate. It sounded like he had been slowly constructing this specific speech in his head for some time now. But I would honestly rather die out there in the open air than stay inside this place and slowly disappear. I would rather fall down dead on a dirt road somewhere than sit in that big dining room for one more week and watch all these people waiting for families who are never, ever going to come. Rose just stared up at the dark ceiling. If we leave here, she said very carefully, where would we even go? I don't know, he said. Your medication, she reminded him. I still have enough pills left for 2 whole weeks if I am very careful, Anthony said. Anthony, Rose started to object. We are leaving, he said. They walked very carefully. Anthony was heavily using his wooden stick. Rose stayed incredibly close to his side. She was closely watching every single way he was moving. She watched his breathing rate. She watched his walking pace. She watched the tight set of his shoulders. She was literally always watching these small things now, reading his body the exact same way a farmer reads the incoming weather. For the first 30 minutes of walking, he was doing all right. Then the dark sky began to lighten up, and with the morning light came the brutal heat. Even in the very early morning, the hot sun in the city had serious intention. It came up with a blazing purpose, pressing heavily down on the hard concrete pavement and bouncing right back up from the black road surface in thick, shimmering waves. Rose could feel the heat prickling on the back of her neck and on her bare hands. She felt it adding to the heavy weight of her travel bag. She quickly glanced over at Anthony. His walking pace had noticeably slowed down. His breathing had completely changed rhythm. She could clearly hear it now. It was slightly labored, slightly uneven. It was the scary sound she knew all too well. We can stop and rest, she told him. Not yet, he gasped out. There's a bus stop. Rose. Not yet. She didn't push him. She just stayed right beside him and matched his slower pace. And they moved together along the highway's dusty edge while the loud morning traffic began to build up all around them. Fast cars and huge trucks and loud motorbikes pressing past them in a blur. None of them slowing down at all. All of them full of busy people going somewhere, with the complete, blind indifference of people who actually have somewhere important to go. Just an old, tired couple walking on the dangerous side of the highway carrying 2 small bags. Nobody stopped. Nobody even looked at them. A whole hour passed by, maybe even more. Rose's own legs were seriously aching now. Her old knees were sending up their familiar, shooting complaints. But she firmly pushed the feeling down and just kept moving her feet. She could afford to be tired later. Right now, she desperately needed to watch Anthony. He had suddenly gone very, very quiet. That was the one sign she had learned to dread way more than any other sign. When Anthony went perfectly quiet like this, not the nice, thoughtful quiet of a man just thinking about things, but the strained, effortful quiet of a man who is conserving absolutely everything he has left just to keep his feet moving. It meant something was going very wrong inside his chest. Something was working way too hard. Anthony, she said sharply, we really need to stop. Just a little further, he wheezed. His voice was incredibly thinner than it had been an hour ago. Now, she commanded. He stopped walking. She quickly guided him over to the edge of the paved road, where there was a low, dirty concrete barrier. She forced him to sit down on it. He sat down heavily, exactly like something invisible had been holding him up and had just let go of him all at once. His wooden walking stick rattled loudly against the hard concrete. She quickly crouched down right in front of him and looked closely at his face. It was totally gray. It was damp with cold sweat despite the blazing early heat. His lips had turned a strange color she really didn't like at all. "Your pills," she demanded. "Did you take them this morning before we left?" "Yes," he nodded weakly. "When did you last have a drink of water?" He actually had to think about it for a second. That fact alone worried her immensely. The terrifying fact that he actually had to think about it. She frantically dug her hands in her bag and found the small plastic water bottle she had filled up at the sink. Before they left the room, she pressed it firmly into his shaking hands. He drank it slowly. All around them, the massive highway roared and rushed with noise. The sun was fully up in the sky now. It was flat and hard, and it offered absolutely no mercy to anyone. Rose stood straight up and looked at the busy road. She looked at the speeding cars going past them. She looked at the wide, empty landscape spreading all around them. The long highway stretching endlessly in both directions. A few low, square buildings sitting way off in the far distance. Nothing close by at all. She understood suddenly, with a sharp clarity that hit her in the chest like a bucket of freezing cold water, exactly how alone they truly were. They had no cell phone. They had no money to speak of. They had nobody in the world who even knew where they were. Just an old woman and a very sick old man sitting on the side of a loud highway, and the whole world going past them at 60 miles an hour without even a single glance in their direction. She fiercely didn't let herself feel the rising panic. Not yet. The fear could come later. She would definitely find a private moment to feel it later, the exact way she always did. Right now, she needed to think fast. She looked back down at Anthony. His breathing was still terribly uneven. His hand, resting on the concrete barrier, was visibly trembling. She looked back up at the road. She bravely stepped right to the very edge of the white line and held out her arm. The first car zipped by and didn't stop. The second car didn't stop. The third truck didn't stop. She kept her arms stretched out. She stood as tall as her 70-year-old body would possibly allow, and she held her arm out at the rushing, dangerous traffic, and she absolutely did not move an inch. "Rose," Anthony whispered weakly from behind her. "Be quiet," she said gently but firmly over her shoulder. Another car flew by, not stopping. Another one passed. She tightly closed her eyes. She didn't pray any fancy, complicated prayers. She never had. She just said inside her head, in the direct and very simple way she had always talked to God, "Please, he needs help. Please send someone. Send anybody." She slowly opened her eyes, and an old, beat-up car, dented and dusty and moving way slower than the rest of the traffic around it, suddenly pulled over to the side of the road. The dusty car stopped about 20 feet ahead of where they were sitting. It just sat there idling, with its hazard lights blinking bright orange, 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 while the loud traffic kept rushing past on the left side. For a long second, absolutely nothing happened. Then the driver's side door popped open and a young man got out. He looked to be perhaps 30 years old. He was not super tall. He was not very large. He was just a completely ordinary young man dressed in dirty work clothes. Dark canvas trousers and a pale blue button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He had a very plain, open, honest face and dark eyes that moved rapidly from Rose standing there, over to Anthony sitting on the barrier, taking in the whole scary situation with the laser-focused attention of someone who immediately understood that something was very wrong here. He walked straight toward them without hesitating for a second. "Are you all right?" he asked loudly over the noise. He looked down at Anthony, slumped on the barrier, at the wooden walking stick on the ground, at Rose's outstretched arm, still hanging in the hot air. "What happened to you? Are you hurt?" "My husband," Rose said quickly. Her voice miraculously came out much steadier than she actually felt. "His heart is bad. He needs to sit down properly in the shade." He needs water and... Okay, the young man said. He just said that. Okay, like it was the most simple thing in the world. Like there was absolutely nothing else to even consider. He walked straight over to Anthony. He crouched down right in front of him, the exact same way Rose had just done, and looked closely at his gray face. And then, completely without asking for permission, he put his strong arm firmly around the old man's back and slid his other hand right under his armpit. "I've got you," he said to Anthony in a nice, slow, calming voice. "We're going to get you into the car right now." Anthony looked at him. Rose could easily see the old familiar pride moving across her husband's face. The stubborn instinct to push him away and say, "I can manage this myself. I don't need any help from strangers." And she watched Anthony look deeply at this young stranger's face and somehow find something there that made him finally let the stubborn pride go. "All right," Anthony said quietly. "All right," the young man repeated gently. Together, moving slowly, they walked over to the dented car. His name was Marcos. He told them this fact while he was gently helping Anthony slide into the back seat, pulling the seatbelt safely across his chest with careful, grease-stained hands, checking to make sure his legs were comfortable. Then he took both of their small travel bags and put them safely in the boot. He walked around and opened the front passenger door for Rose with a natural politeness that instantly made her think he had been raised by a good mother who taught him exactly how to treat people. "Where are you folks going?" Marcos asked as he got into the driver's seat and put the car in gear. Rose opened her mouth to speak, but then she closed it again. She had absolutely no answer to that question. Marcos looked at her expression in the rearview mirror. He seemed to understand instantly. He didn't push her for an answer. "Hospital first," he declared firmly. "We will figure everything else out after that." He signaled and pulled the car back into the rushing traffic. In the back seat, Anthony's head fell back heavily against the headrest. Rose turned around and nervously looked at him every few minutes. His skin color was still definitely not good, but the terrible trembling in his hands had eased up just slightly. She desperately thought that was better. She truly hoped that was better. Marcos drove the car without speaking another word, which she was incredibly grateful for. She simply wasn't ready to explain anything to anyone yet. She just sat there with her bag on her lap and looked out the window at the blurry city passing by, and she suddenly felt something she hadn't felt in many weeks. She felt like someone else was doing the steering. Not her, not Anthony. Someone else, for just this one tiny moment, was doing the heavy steering, and she could just sit back in the passenger seat and simply breathe in and out. She hadn't even realized how thoroughly exhausted she was until this exact moment, when she didn't have to be the only one holding everything in the world together. She breathed. The hospital emergency room was 20 minutes away. Marcos pulled right up to the red emergency entrance zone. He had Anthony carefully out of the car and settled into a waiting wheelchair before Rose had even managed to get her own door fully open. Marcos immediately spoke to the triage woman at the front desk with a calm directness that moved things along in a way that Rose, arriving all alone and looking old and uncertain, probably might not have managed as quickly. 80 years old, known heart condition, has been standing on his feet in the extreme heat for over an hour, showing visible signs of severe cardiac stress. Marcos listed off. "He needs to be seen by a doctor right now." The nurse behind the desk looked at Anthony's gray face. She nodded quickly. She immediately picked up her desk phone. Within 3 minutes, Anthony was being wheeled rapidly through the big swinging double doors. Rose started to walk after him. A nurse stopped her gently with a hand on her arm. "We will take very good care of him, ma'am. Please wait right out here, and we will come and get you as soon as he is stabilized and settled." The heavy double doors swung closed with a thud. Rose just stood there in the brightly lit corridor and stared at the empty space where her husband had just disappeared. She stood there frozen for a moment that felt so much longer than it actually was. Then she felt a gentle, warm touch at her elbow. Marcos was standing right beside her. He was holding out a small plastic cup of cold water. "Come and sit down over here," he said softly. They walked over and sat down in the crowded waiting area, in 2 hard plastic chairs pushed up against a pale green painted wall. Rose held her cup of cold water with both hands. Marcos sat right beside her. He rested his elbows on his knees. He was not speaking. He was not staring at his phone. He was just present, just being there. After a long while, Rose finally turned to him. "You will be late for your work," she said softly. "It's okay," he replied. "You don't even know who we are," she added. He was quiet for a second. "My grandmother was in a place exactly like this once," he said softly, staring at the floor. "A hospital waiting room, and nobody ever came to sit with her." He looked down at his calloused hands. "I was living way too far away at the time. By the time I finally got there, it was too late." He paused and took a breath. "I really do not like the idea of people sitting all alone in hospitals." Rose looked at him. She looked at his plain, open face, at the genuine way he said it, not acting for effect, not saying it to be thanked, just offering a simple statement of fact, the exact way you explain why you do any normal thing in life. "What's your name again?" she asked him softly. "Marcos," he said. "Marcos." She repeated the name to memorize it. "I am Rose." "I know you are," he said, giving a small smile. "Your husband kept saying it the whole way over here in the car. Rose this, Rose that." His smile grew a little bit. "He sure talks about you an awful lot for a guy who's actively having a heart episode." Rose laughed. The sudden sound completely surprised her. The laugh just came bubbling out before she could even stop it. It was small and sudden, and it left her feeling both much lighter and somehow much closer to crying tears at the exact same time. She quickly pressed her hand over her mouth. "I am so sorry," she apologized. "Don't be sorry," Marcos said kindly. "It is a very good sound to hear." 3 agonizing hours passed by slowly. Finally, a tired-looking doctor came out through the double doors and spoke privately to Rose. Anthony had suffered what they technically called a mild cardiac event. It was thankfully not the massive, full heart attack she had been terrified of, but it was still quite serious. His old heart was under significant dangerous stress. He desperately needed deep rest, a major medication adjustment, and constant monitoring. He would absolutely need to stay admitted in a room for at least 2 nights. "Is there any family we can contact for you?" the doctor asked her, holding his clipboard. Rose thought instantly about Robert. She thought about Sandra. She thought about Benjamin. "No," she said firmly. "There's nobody else." The doctor nodded his head and went back through the double doors. Rose walked back and sat down in the hard plastic chair. Marcos was remarkably still sitting there. He had walked over and bought them both sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria at some point, along with a proper large bottle of cold water. He had quietly set them down on the empty chair beside her without making a big fuss about it. She looked at him in disbelief. "You have your own whole life to get to," she told him. "You really should go now." "I will go when I know for sure that you are all right," Marcos replied firmly. "Marcos, please." "Mrs. Rose," he said. He said her name firmly, but very kindly. Exactly the way you speak to someone you deeply respect, but are definitely not going to agree with. "Please just eat your sandwich." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she slowly picked up the wrapped sandwich and took a bite. She ended up telling him absolutely everything that evening. She definitely hadn't planned to spill her life story, but he was amazingly still there sitting with her when official visiting hours finally started, and he quietly walked with her down the hall to Anthony's private room. And he just stood quietly out of the way in the corner while Rose sat down beside Anthony's hospital bed and tightly held his hand. Anthony slowly opened his eyes and looked over at Marcos, standing there. "You're still here?" Anthony whispered. "Yes, sir," Marcos answered respectfully. "Why?" Anthony asked. Marcos considered this question carefully. "I am honestly not sure I can go until I know what happens to you next," he said honestly. "If that makes any sense." Anthony looked at him for a very long time, with the focused, sharp eyes of a man who has spent 78 years reading other people's intentions. "It makes sense," Anthony finally said. Then he turned his head and looked at Rose. "Tell him everything," Anthony instructed her. "Anthony," Rose started. "Tell him, Rose. From the very beginning." So, she did exactly that. She told Marcos all about the nice house with the green painted door, about her 3 children and their constant complaints, and the fat folder of medical bills thrown on the kitchen table. She told him all about the awful morning they were gathered together in the living room like it was some kind of business meeting, and about overhearing Sandra and Benjamin's greedy conversation through the open kitchen window while hanging laundry. She told him about the transport van and the men in blue uniforms and the fake hugs and promises that everyone present knew were absolutely not real promises. She told him every detail about the care facility, about poor Dorothy waiting by the window, about Anthony going completely quiet in the mornings, about lying awake at night and just listening to his struggling heart. She told him about the scary decision to sneak out before dawn and walk the highway. Marcos stood in the corner and listened to every single word of it without interrupting her even once. When she finally finished speaking, the small room was completely quiet except for the soft, steady beep of Anthony's heart monitor doing its patient, rhythmic work. Marcos looked down at the linoleum floor for a long moment. Then he slowly looked back up. His face had completely changed. It wasn't dramatically different. He just wasn't the kind of man for big, dramatic expressions. But something deep in his dark eyes was different. Something solid had settled there. A kind of quiet, absolute decision. It was the exact way a thing looks once a person has firmly made up their mind to do something. "I need to go make a quick phone call," he announced. He stepped out of the room into the busy corridor. Rose looked down at Anthony in the bed. "What do you think about him?" she asked quietly. Anthony looked at the empty doorway where Marcos had just gone out. "I think," Anthony said slowly, "that God actually listened to you praying this morning on that road." Rose turned back to look at the heart monitor with its steady, faithful beeping sound. "I think so too," she agreed softly. Marcos was gone out in the hall for about 15 minutes. Rose used the quiet time to do exactly what she always did whenever she needed to steady her nerves. She focused entirely on small, practical tasks. She poured Anthony a fresh cup of water from the plastic jug resting on his bedside table. She smoothed out and straightened his thin hospital blanket. She dug around and found a small comb inside her travel bag and gently, carefully combed his messy white hair the exact way she knew he liked it. Parted neatly on the left side, flat and very neat. Anthony submitted to all of this attention quietly, keeping his eyes half closed. "You really don't have to fuss over me," he murmured. "I'm not fussing over you," she replied. "I am just combing your hair." "Same thing," he mumbled. "It is absolutely not the same thing," she said. He smiled, just slightly, just a tiny bit, but it was enough. She put the comb away and sat back down in the chair and held his hand tightly, and they just waited together. When Marcos finally came back into the room, his expression was different once again. It was much lighter this time, looking exactly like the phone call had magically resolved something rather than complicating it further. He pulled the spare plastic chair from the corner of the room and sat down right across from both of them. "I just called my wife," he announced. "You are married?" Rose asked in surprise. 6 years now," he said. There was a quiet, deep pride in his voice. "Her name is Anna. I just told her everything you told me just now." Rose looked at Anthony in alarm. Anthony looked right at Marcos. "Everything?" Anthony asked. "Everything," Marcos confirmed. Marcos leaned forward slightly and rested his elbows on his knees. "She really wants to meet you both," he said. "She had some very choice things to say about your children that I am definitely not going to repeat out loud in a hospital room." A small smile crept onto his face. "Anna has very strong feelings about things like this. It is one of the main reasons I married her." Despite absolutely everything going on, despite where they were sitting and exactly how they had gotten here, Rose suddenly felt something shift and move inside her chest. It was something warm and totally unexpected, exactly like bright sunlight coming through a window you had completely forgotten was even there. "She doesn't even know us," Rose pointed out. "No," Marcos agreed. "But she knows enough about you now." He paused for a second. "We have a house. It is definitely not very big, but there is a spare room that we currently use for junk storage. But it isn't really storage. It's just full of old boxes we keep telling ourselves we'll sort out and never actually do." He looked at both of them very steadily. "Anna says we could easily have it cleared out and ready by the time you're discharged from here, if you wanted to come stay." The room went very, very quiet. The heart monitor beeped steadily. "You are offering us a room," Anthony said slowly, trying to understand. "We are offering you a home," Marcos corrected him gently, "for as long as you want to stay in it. Both of you." He said it so simply, totally without any big performance, exactly the way he had said everything else today. Like it was just the most obvious, natural next thing to do. Anna's exact words to me on the phone were, "Bring them here, Marcos." So, Rose looked down at her wrinkled hands resting in her lap. She looked at Anthony's hand trapped under hers. She looked at the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, the cheap plastic jug of water, the pale green painted wall. She thought very hard about all the painful things she had just told this young man tonight. 50 whole years of her private life, just laid out bare in a sterile hospital room. And she thought about exactly what it meant that a total stranger had sat and listened to all of it. And this beautiful offer was his response. She pressed her lips tightly together. "We simply cannot ask you to do this for us," she said. "You didn't ask me," Marcos pointed out quickly. "I offered it to you. We are old, and we take up a lot of space, and Anthony has serious medical needs that are—" Mrs. Rose, he stopped her. "My grandmother," he said very quietly. "The one I told you about out there. The one who was left alone in the hospital waiting room." He paused. "She died out there not knowing that anyone was even coming for her. I have thought about that terrible fact every single day of my adult life." He looked at her directly in the eyes. "I am absolutely not going to be the reason another human being ever feels that way. Not when I can actually do something about it." The hospital room was silent. Anthony was closely watching Marcos with the exact same long, careful, measuring look he had given him earlier. He was reading him, taking the true measure of the man. "Young man," Anthony said finally. "Sir, Marcos Viplaev, what exactly do you do for work?" Anthony asked. Marcos looked slightly surprised by the sudden random question, given everything else they were talking about. "I am a mechanic," Marcos answered. "I own a small garage. Nothing very big." Anthony nodded his head slowly. "Did you build something yourself?" Anthony asked. "I did," Marcos said. "With your own two hands, mostly?" "Yes, sir." Anthony was quiet for another long moment. Then he slowly looked over at Rose. And Rose knew that exact look. She had seen it 10,000 times over 50 years. It was the look that simply meant, this is the right thing. I know it, and you know it, and there's absolutely no use pretending otherwise. She turned her head back to Marcos. "We would very much like to meet your Anna," she said softly. Anna came bounding in the very next morning. Rose actually heard her coming before she even saw her. She heard a quick, bright, energetic voice out in the corridor asking a nurse which room they were in. And then the door swung open, and a young woman came rushing and carrying a large plastic container of hot food. She was wearing an expression of such open, unguarded, raw emotion that Rose instinctively stood right up from her chair. Anna was perhaps 28 years old. She was small and very quick-moving, with bright dark eyes and the kind of expressive face that instantly shows you everything it is thinking. She looked directly at Rose first, and immediately crossed the small room and took both of Rose's hands tightly in hers. "I am so incredibly angry at your children," Anna said loudly by way of introduction. Rose laughed out loud. It was that surprised laugh again, the one she simply couldn't stop. "I'm Anna," the young woman said warmly. "I brought you guys some real food, because hospital food is an absolute insult to people who are already suffering." She firmly set the warm container down on the little table, then turned around and pointed her finger right at Anthony in the bed. You need to eat this and rest, and absolutely not argue with anyone today. Marcos told me on the phone you're stubborn." "Marcos doesn't even know me yet," Anthony grumbled. "He has known you for exactly 1 day, and he already knows it for a fact." Anna shot back with a grin. She popped open the container lid. "I made chicken soup. It is nothing complicated, but it is very good, and it is actual real food." She moved around the small hospital room with a natural ease that instantly made it feel suddenly less clinical and cold. She magically found some bowls somewhere in a cabinet. She neatly organized the cluttered bedside table. She sat down in the spare plastic chair and just talked and talked. She talked all about the spare room she and Marcos were busy clearing out. She talked about their neighborhood, about the busy market 2 streets away, where the fresh vegetables were so much better than anywhere else in town. She talked exactly the way some warm people do, not just to nervously fill up silence, but because she was genuinely present and genuinely interested and had a massive amount of warmth that just desperately needed somewhere to go. Anthony watched her bustling around with a growing expression on his face that Rose completely recognized, too. It was the exact expression he used to wear years ago, watching their own children when they were small and sweet and good, long before everything in life became so complicated and bitter. It was the soft expression of someone being completely unexpectedly delighted. By the time Anthony was finally officially discharged 2 days later, the spare room in Marcos and Anna's house was totally ready for them. Anna had snapped a photograph on her phone and sent it to Marcos, which he proudly showed to Rose in the hospital corridor while they waited for the paperwork. It was a simple, nice room. It had a proper, comfortable bed, a wooden wardrobe for clothes, a nice window that looked directly out onto a small backyard with a tree in it. It had clean, bright curtains and a small bedside table with a nice reading lamp. Rose looked closely at the glowing photograph for a very long time. "That tree," she said softly. "What kind of tree is it?" Marcos looked closer at his phone screen. "I actually don't know for sure. Anna is the one who planted it. You could ask her when we get there. It really looks like it might be a lemon tree," Rose said very quietly. Marcos looked at her face, saw whatever deep emotion was written in it, and wisely didn't ask any questions. The car drive over to Marcos and Anna's house took them slowly through older parts of the big city that Rose hadn't ever really seen before. Smaller, narrower streets, quieter streets, streets with long washing lines strung up between the brick buildings, and laughing children riding bicycles on the sidewalks, and little corner shops with their front doors propped wide open to the breeze. The house itself was quite modest. It was a low, solid little building with a small, messy garden out front. It was painted a faded yellow color that had probably once been much brighter years ago. There was a bicycle casually leaning against the outside wall, and a muddy pair of heavy work boots sitting right by the front door. Anna was already standing on the front step waiting for them. She had clearly been eagerly watching the street for the car, because she came hurrying down the front path before Marcos had even fully stopped the engine. She immediately opened the back door for Anthony with the careful, hovering attention of someone who had spent hours thinking about exactly how to do this correctly. Slowly now, she told him gently, "There is absolutely no hurry." She and Marcos got Anthony safely up the concrete path, supporting him. Between them, Rose followed right behind them, carrying both of their small travel bags. She looked around at the small front garden. It was a little overgrown, with a few bright flowers struggling cheerfully to poke through the green weeds. She looked at the front door. It was painted blue, not green, but it was a very good color, she thought to herself. A very welcoming, warm color. She stepped carefully inside the house. The spare room was exactly as the digital photograph had shown it to be, but it felt so much warmer in person. Anna had thoughtfully put a small glass vase of fresh flowers on the little bedside table. Just simple, colorful ones bought from the local market, probably. And she had neatly folded the thick blanket back, exactly the way you do when you want a guest to feel truly expected and welcome. Rose just stood there in the doorway and looked at it all. She felt Anthony come up and stand quietly beside her. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Right behind them, Marcos and Anna stood together in the narrow hallway. And there was a small, heavy silence that somehow contained absolutely everything. It contained all the strangeness and all the sadness and the extraordinary, unbelievable unlikeliness of how they had all somehow ended up right here, in this exact moment, standing in this small square room with its clean window and its warm lamp and its little vase of simple flowers. Then Rose finally walked into the room and set her heavy bag down on the chair. "Right," she said briskly, clapping her hands once. "Let's get you lying down in this bed." "I'm totally fine," Anthony grumbled. "You literally just left the hospital," she scolded. "Lie down right now." "She is right," Anna chimed in from the doorway. Anthony looked over at Marcos, desperately seeking some male support. "Don't look at me," Marcos chuckled, holding his hands up. Anthony muttered something grumpy under his breath, but he slowly sat down on the soft bed. Anna caught Rose's eye from across the room and smiled. It was a quick, bright, conspiratorial smile. The knowing smile of one woman to another woman that clearly said, "We understand each other perfectly." That evening, they all sat down and ate dinner together at the small wooden kitchen table. It was a very simple meal. Just hot rice, black beans, and some chicken that Anna had cooked with special herbs. It filled the whole entire house with a smell so warm and ordinary and perfectly good that Rose had to actually stop walking in the kitchen doorway for a second and just breathe it all in. She thought to herself, this is exactly what a real house is supposed to smell like. They talked while they ate. Not about big, heavy, depressing things. Just about small, normal things. Marcos talked about his garage and a difficult, annoying customer he'd had to deal with that week. Anna talked about her busy work at the local community center. They talked about the tree in the backyard, which Anna happily confirmed was indeed a lemon tree. And at this simple piece of information, Rose and Anthony quickly exchanged a deep, knowing look that they did not bother to explain to the others. After they finished dinner, Marcos got up and made hot tea, and they all sat around the table a little bit longer. Outside the window, the noisy city settled down into its dark evening routine. Inside the small, faded yellow house on the quiet street, four people sat together around a scratched kitchen table. The conversation moved so easily and naturally between them. The tea was perfectly hot, and the overhead lamp was warm. Rose looked across the table at Anthony. His skin color was so much better than it had been in long weeks. He was sitting up very straight in his chair, exactly the way he used to sit when he felt completely like himself. He was listening intently to something Marcos was explaining, with genuine, bright interest shining in his eyes. He suddenly looked up and caught her watching him, and he smiled at her, the real smile, the big, wide one she had completely fallen in love with all those years ago, the one that had been hiding away behind all those gray, awful, difficult weeks. She smiled right back at him. "More tea?" Anna asked, holding up the pot. "Please," said Rose. 3 whole weeks passed by smoothly. Then 4 weeks. The slow days in the small yellow house had a wonderful, soft gentleness to them that Rose hadn't known in many years. She woke up in the mornings without that awful, crushing heaviness sitting in her chest. Or at least, without the very particular type of heaviness that had lived there in the big house with the green door. She still always woke up very early, exactly as she always had her whole life. But now the quiet early morning actually felt like a beautiful gift rather than a heavy, exhausting duty. She and Anna had quickly developed a quiet, unspoken morning rhythm together without ever even discussing it. Rose always came out to the kitchen first and put the water on the stove to boil. Anna always came down the stairs exactly 10 minutes later, and they simply moved around each other in the small space with the comfortable, easy grace of 2 people who had silently decided to just trust each other completely. They talked about small, nice things in the early morning light. What to cook for dinner, the weather forecast, something funny Anna had heard the kids say at the community center. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, and that was perfectly comfortable, too. Anthony was slowly getting stronger. Not quickly, and definitely not without some scary setbacks. There were some bad days when he barely left the bed at all. Days when his damaged heart violently reminded him of its strict limitations. But there were also wonderfully good days. Days when he sat out in the small garden with Marcos on the weekend, the 2 of them just talking happily about the lemon tree and the broken state of the wooden fence and other highly practical things that needed doing around the yard. There were days when the healthy color actually stayed in his face all the way through to the evening time. Rose watched him very carefully and said absolutely nothing out loud about what she saw, but she saw it all happening. One morning, about 4 weeks in, Anna came downstairs to find Rose already busy cooking. And not just boiling water for tea. She was cooking a massive, full breakfast. Fried eggs, sweet fried plantain, buttered toast, hot coffee. Everything was neatly arranged on the counter with the flawless, efficient organization of a woman who had been feeding large groups of people for 50 years. Anna just stood there in the kitchen doorway and stared at the huge spread. "Rose," she said softly, "you really don't have to do all this." "I know I don't," Rose replied, flipping an egg. "I wanted to do it." Anna looked at her back for a long moment. Then she walked over and stood right beside her at the hot stove and picked up a spare spatula. "You have to show me exactly how you do the plantain," Anna requested. "Mine always comes out totally wrong and soggy." You are using way too much oil in the pan, Rose said immediately without looking. See? Anna laughed loudly. Marcos says the exact same thing to me, and I always just think he's wrong. He is definitely not wrong, Rose smiled. Just don't tell him that. They stood there at the hot stove together in the pale, early morning light. Rose patiently showing Anna the exact right heat to use, the exact perfect moment to turn the slices over. All the tiny, specific things that took many years of practice to actually learn, but that she could freely give away to someone for nothing. This was also exactly how Rose showed her love. She hadn't lost that part of herself. Marcos came trudging down the stairs a few minutes later to find a huge breakfast sitting on the table and both women already comfortably seated. He stopped dead in the kitchen doorway, staring at the massive spread. I thought I smelled real cooking, he said in awe. Sit down, Anna ordered him. Rose made all of it. Marcos looked at Rose with wide eyes. You really didn't have to. If one more single person says that phrase to me today, Rose interrupted pleasantly, I am going to be very upset. Marcos quickly sat down in his chair. He picked up his fork and tried the fried plantain. He chewed it slowly. Then he looked over at Anna. This is way better than yours, he stated bravely. I know it is, Anna agreed easily. She just show me how. Can she show you again tomorrow? Marcos asked cheekily. Maybe several more times? Anna grabbed a piece of crusty bread and threw it right at his head. Anthony suddenly arrived at the kitchen door at that exact moment, heavily leaning on his walking stick. He stood there and took in a chaotic scene. The piece of bread lying on the floor, Marcos laughing out loud, Anna trying very hard not to laugh, Rose shaking her head with the fond expression of a woman completely surrounded by beloved idiots. He slowly pulled out his wooden chair and sat down at the table. Just a normal morning then, he said dryly. It was on a normal Tuesday, exactly 5 weeks after their arrival at the Yellow House, that the strange letter finally came. Rose was out in the small garden with Anthony. He was sitting peacefully in his folding chair in the bright morning sun. She was busy doing something with a messy flower bed that Anna had started to work on and then completely abandoned. It was a project of turning the wild weeds into something much more organized. Rose had her bare hands deep in the dark soil. She was happily thinking about absolutely nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of wonderful luxury she had almost forgotten existed. She suddenly heard Anna call out from inside the house. Rose, there's a man standing at the front door. He is asking to speak to Anthony. Rose looked up from the dirt. She and Anthony quickly exchanged a confused glance. What kind of man? Anthony called back loudly. He says he is from a downtown law firm. Anna yelled back. A heavy silence fell over the garden. Rose slowly sat back on her heels. She looked down at her hands, which were dark with damp soil. She looked over at Anthony. His facial expression was one she completely couldn't read at all. Send him out here. Anthony finally called out. The man who walked out was quite young, probably no more than 30 years old. He was dressed in a very neat, expensive suit that was definitely slightly too warm for the hot weather outside. He carried a thick leather folder tucked under his arm. He had the very careful, highly precise manner of someone who has been specially trained to deliver difficult information to people without causing any drama. He looked down at Anthony sitting in his garden chair, and then he checked a piece of paper in his folder. Mr. Anthony Walker? He asked formally. That's me, Anthony confirmed. My name is Daniel Cole. I am an attorney with Henry & Burns, attorneys at law. He carefully opened the leather folder. We have been attempting to reach you for quite some time now, sir. We only had a previous residential address on file for you. We moved out, Anthony said simply. Yes, sir. We eventually located your current whereabouts through the hospital admission records, with your explicit permission obtained through the care facility management. He nervously cleared his throat. Mr. Walker, I am here today regarding the large estate of your late grandfather, Mr. George Walker, who passed away exactly 3 years ago. Rose slowly lowered her gardening trowel. Anthony said absolutely nothing. His lined face was very, very still. Your grandfather, the young man in the suit, continued smoothly, left behind a very substantial estate. Under the strict terms of his written will, the entire estate automatically passes to his eldest surviving male descendant, which our extensive research has completely confirmed is you. He paused to let that sink in. The estate currently includes 10 residential rental properties located across the city, which are all currently managed by our firm, and liquid cash assets totaling just over $20 million. The small garden was incredibly quiet. Somewhere up in the green branches of the lemon tree, a tiny bird was making a small, persistent chirping sound. 20 million, Anthony repeated softly. Yes, sir, the lawyer confirmed. $? Anthony asked. Yes, sir. $. Anthony looked over at Rose. Rose looked back at Anthony. Neither of them spoke a single word for a long moment. Then Anthony said, in the exact same quiet, steady voice, "And why exactly is this information only reaching me right now? 3 whole years after my grandfather died." The young man in the suit shifted his weight slightly on the grass. "That is something we really need to discuss with you, sir. We have been regularly sending correspondence to your old address for 3 years now. The formal letters were definitely received. We have the legal delivery confirmations, but we never received any response back." He paused very carefully, choosing his next words. "It was only when our firm finally escalated this matter to a formal private search that we were able to determine that you had apparently never even seen the letters." Rose felt it right then. The awful thing she had been just about to understand, arriving fully formed and totally terrible in her brain. She instantly thought of Sandra's fat folder. She thought of Sandra's cold, careful eyes watching her pack her bags. She thought of the big pile of important papers that was literally always sitting on the kitchen table. Sandra, the professional accountant, the one who sorted all the daily household mail, the one who handled all the outside correspondence, the one who absolutely always knew exactly what money was coming in and what money was going out. Her cold voice echoing through the open kitchen window. "The house is ours. It always should have been." "The letters," Rose said, and her voice came out very, very soft. "They went to our old house on Maple Street." "Yes, ma'am," the lawyer nodded. "And someone living there received them from the postman. The certified delivery records clearly show they were signed for upon receipt." Rose stood straight up from the flower bed. She didn't even bother to brush the dark soil from her hands. She just stood there in the small garden in the bright morning sun, and she felt something dark and heavy move right through her veins. It was not anger. Not yet, anyway. It was something much older and much colder than simple anger. It was the terrifying feeling of understanding something evil completely. Anthony was closely watching her face. "They knew," she whispered. It was not a question. "Rose," Anthony warned softly. "They knew." "Anthony," she repeated. Her voice was still quiet, still incredibly steady. The whole entire time, while complaining about the medication bills and the electricity cost and the price of the eggs, she stopped and steadied her breathing. "They were going to send us away to a home and keep the letters hidden and just wait for you to die." Anthony said absolutely nothing. The young man in the hot suit just looked back and forth between them with a careful, blank expression. He had the look of someone who understood perfectly well that something huge and significant was happening right in front of him, and that his only job right now was simply to stand there and be completely still. Anna had quietly come to the back door at some point. Rose didn't even know exactly when she had stepped out. Anna was just standing there on the step, holding a dish towel tightly in her hands. And her face, that open, wonderfully expressive face that always showed everything she felt, showed exactly this. Her dark eyes were bright with blazing anger. She wasn't angry for herself. She was angry for them. Rose looked at her face and, suddenly, unexpectedly, felt the sharp sting of hot tears in her eyes. It was not from grief this time. It was from something else entirely. It was from the very particular, beautiful feeling of being truly seen by someone, of having another human being feel absolute outrage on your behalf when you're simply too tired to feel it for yourself. She pressed her lips together to stop the tears, and she turned back to the young man in the suit. "What do we need to do now?" she asked him firmly. "I have several legal documents here for Mr. Walker to review and officially sign," the lawyer said, tapping his folder. "We will definitely need to formally establish your new residential address with the firm's records, and we would highly recommend engaging your own independent legal counsel as well to review everything. We will come down to your office downtown, Rose declared. This week. Of course, ma'am. Would Thursday be acceptable? Tomorrow, Rose said flatly. The young man looked at her hard face. Then he nodded his head. Tomorrow, he agreed. That evening, long after dinner was finished, after the young man had gone back downtown and the thick stack of papers was sitting on the kitchen table, and Anna had made a fresh pot of tea that nobody was really drinking, the four of them sat together in the small, warm kitchen. Nobody spoke for a long while. Then Marcos said very carefully, "What are you going to do about this?" Anthony looked down at the legal papers. Then he looked at Rose. "That is a very good question," he sighed. "Your children," Marcos started to say, "they will definitely find out about this eventually." "Yes," Anthony nodded heavily. "They will find out. And they will come running," Anna added, her voice totally flat and disgusted. "People exactly like that always come running back when the big money appears." There was another long silence. Rose wrapped her dirty hands tightly around her warm teacup. She sat there and thought deeply about Robert's stiff, fake hug. She thought about Sandra's icy, cool fingers. She thought about Benjamin's lazy, comfortable laugh. She thought about a beautiful lemon tree and a green-painted door and 50 whole years of pure love that had been given freely and hoarded by selfish people who never, ever understood what they were holding in their hands. She thought about tiny Dorothy, still sitting by the glass window, watching the empty parking lot. She thought about strict Margaret, 14 months abandoned, and still sitting upright with dignity. She thought about all those lonely people locked in that sterile facility who were just waiting for someone to come save them. She slowly looked up from her tea. "I know exactly what I want to do," she announced to the table. Everyone stopped and looked at her. "I don't mean about the children," she clarified. "I know exactly what to do about them too, but that part can wait for now." She set down her ceramic cup. "I mean with it. With the money. With all the properties." She looked right at Marcos. Then she looked at Anna. Then she looked at Anthony. "I know what I want to do with it." Anthony looked closely at her face. He gave her that long look again, reading her mind, knowing her heart. And slowly he nodded his head. "Tell us," he said simply. Rose was quiet for a brief moment before she spoke. It was not because she was unsure of her plan. She had known exactly what to do the very second she fully understood what the massive inheritance actually meant. It came with a shining clarity that felt less like making a hard decision and much more like a sudden recognition. Like it was something that had always been true, just waiting patiently for her to finally catch up to it. She was only quiet because she desperately wanted to say it exactly right. That care facility, she began softly. Sunrise Care. Everyone at the table waited. Dorothy, she listed off. The tiny woman by the window. Margaret. Old Henry, the man with the wonderful laugh. She paused and took a breath. There are good people sitting in that awful place who have been stuck there for years and years. And it's not because they actually need intense medical care. It's not because they can't still think clearly or feel things or contribute beauty to the world. She looked back down at her hands wrapped around the teacup. They're locked in there simply because their families selfishly decided they were inconvenient to deal with. The small kitchen was completely still. "I want to build something real," Rose stated firmly. "Not a sterile facility. Not a cold place with plastic clipboards and strict visiting hours and little rooms that constantly smell of harsh disinfectant. A home," she said, looking back up. "A real, true home where old people can live out their days with respect and dignity. A place where someone actually knows their name and asks them questions about their long life and just sits with them in the morning light." She paused again. "I want to build the kind of place that really should exist everywhere in the world and almost never does." Marcos was leaning far forward over the table, resting on his elbows. Anna had completely stopped pretending to drink her tea. Anthony was intensely watching Rose with a familiar expression she knew well. It was the proud expression of a man watching someone he loved say out loud the exact thing he had been quietly thinking in his own head but had not yet found the right words for. The rental properties, Rose continued laying out the plan. Some of them could easily generate the steady income needed to run the place. And one of them, depending on its size and layout, could actually become the home itself. She turned her head and looked directly at Marcos. You know exactly how to build things and fix broken things with your hands. And Anna, you work hard at a community center. You already understand exactly how to organize a place and make it run smoothly. She looked back and forth between the young couple. I am absolutely not asking you to give up your own lives, but I am asking if you would want to help us build something that is truly worth building. Complete silence fell over the kitchen. Then Anna reached out and put both of her hands flat down on the table. Yes, she said simply and immediately. She said it as easily as if Rose had just asked her whether she wanted to keep breathing oxygen. Marcos looked over at his wife. Then he looked at Rose. Then he looked at Anthony. What does he think about it? Marcos asked gently, nodding his head toward Anthony. Everyone turned and looked at Anthony. Anthony had been totally silent through all of this. He just sat there with his wooden walking stick resting between his knees and his eyes locked on Rose's face. And the expression on his old, lined face was one that Marcos and Anna couldn't fully read yet, simply because they hadn't known him long enough. But Rose could read it perfectly. It was the exact same expression he had worn the day he finally finished building their first house on Maple Street. Standing back in the yard, looking up at it, with green paint smeared on his hands and deep exhaustion in his bones, but absolute, quiet satisfaction shining in his eyes. It was the proud expression of a man who has just clearly seen what he was meant to be building all along. I think, Anthony said very slowly, that I would like to go over and speak to Henry first, and Dorothy, and Margaret. He paused. Before we finalize any big plans, I really want to go over there and ask them exactly what they would want at home, what they actually need. He looked back at Rose. It is going to be their home we are building, after all. They should absolutely have a say in how it works. Rose felt a sudden rush of warmth spread through her chest. It was so strong it almost physically hurt. Yes, she smiled. Exactly that. Thursday morning came quickly. They had deliberately pushed the lawyer's appointment back by one day to prepare. Marcos drove them safely downtown to the fancy offices of Henry and Burns, which occupied 3 whole floors of a massive glass building right in the center of the busy business district. Rose proudly wore her very best dress. Anthony wore the nice jacket she had quickly packed in their small bag on the dark night they left the house. It was his good jacket, the dark navy one with the shiny gold buttons that he always saved for very important occasions. He had somehow known. She realized it even then. Or maybe he had just packed it because hope is such a stubborn, powerful thing, and it completely refuses to be left behind, even in the absolute worst moments of a person's life. The legal meeting took 2 full hours. There was a massive amount of complicated paperwork. There was a great deal of careful, boring legal language. But the essential bottom-line facts were incredibly simple. Anthony was the sole legal heir. The entire estate was his. The rental properties were currently generating a very steady, reliable monthly income. The huge pile of liquid cash assets was sitting securely in a bank account that had been quietly and automatically accumulating interest for 3 long years. 3 years. Rose sat quietly in the soft leather chair and listened to the lawyer explain all the big numbers. And right beneath the sound of the numbers, she clearly heard the other thing. All that precious time, all that life-changing money, just sitting there waiting. While Sandra carefully filed the letters away somewhere hidden, and Robert made his fake, hypocritical speeches about sustainability and costs. And Benjamin just laughed his lazy, comfortable laugh. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap and kept her face completely composed. What are our legal options regarding the previous address? She asked clearly when the lawyer finally paused. The lawyer looked at her very carefully. In what specific sense, Mrs. Walker? The certified letters were delivered there and signed for over a period of 3 years, she stated factually, and the people who signed for them actively did not inform my husband of their existence. She paused and stared him in the eye. What exactly does that constitute legally? The lawyer was very quiet for a long moment. He folded his hands neatly on his clean desk. That would very likely constitute active fraud, he said smoothly. Potentially inheritance fraud, depending on the specific circumstances and the provable intent of the parties involved. He paused. Do you wish to legally pursue that action? Rose turned and looked at Anthony. Anthony was staring out the huge glass window at the city. Not yet, Anthony said firmly. We will come back to that specific question later. The promised visit to Sunrise Care Facility happened the very following morning. Rose had intentionally called ahead, not to the facility management, but to Margaret directly through the facility's common hallway phone. Margaret had sounded incredibly surprised at first, and then suddenly not surprised at all, and then finally very pleased, in the exact way of someone who has learned to keep their daily expectations extremely low and is therefore deeply moved by small, unexpected kindnesses. And bring me something from the outside world when you come, Margaret had ordered over the phone. Anything at all. A daily newspaper, a fresh flower, something that actually smells like the real city. You will understand why when you get back here. Rose understood it perfectly before they had even walked through the sliding doors. The terrible smell hit her nose first, the cheap cleaning fluid and the stale sadness that lived underneath it. The two blindingly bright fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The awful, dead stillness of the air inside. The very particular, suffocating stillness of a place where the windows are never opened enough to let the wind blow through. But she walked straight through the lobby with completely different eyes this time. These were not the terrified eyes of someone arriving to be locked away. These were the sharp, calculating eyes of someone assessing a problem. She looked at the common room. It was large enough, but completely sparse and uninviting. She saw the small, sad garden outside the window. It was barely used at all, with the struggling, dying rose bushes. She saw the big dining room with its cheap round tables and its depressing, institutional quietness. She saw the tired staff members. They were busy. They were kind enough. But they were moving with the frantic speed of underpaid people who have way too many tasks and absolutely not enough time to simply sit down and be with someone. She saw Dorothy, still sitting in the exact same chair by the front window. Rose walked straight over to Dorothy first. She pulled up a plastic chair beside her and sat down. Dorothy slowly turned her head and looked at her with that intense, focused look she always wore. And then something suddenly shifted in her cloudy eyes. A spark of recognition. Surprise. You left this place, Dorothy whispered. I did, Rose nodded gently. I didn't think people ever left here, Dorothy said. I didn't think so either, Rose agreed. Dorothy looked at her for a long, silent moment. Where did you go? To somewhere much better, Rose smiled. And that is exactly what I want to talk to you about today. Margaret arrived in the common room exactly then, walking with the straight-backed, proud dignity of a retired school teacher. She firmly shook Rose's hand. She looked over at Anthony with a nod of approval. And then she looked closely at Marcos and Anna. They had come along too, and had stationed themselves quietly near the doorway with the careful, unobtrusive manner of polite people trying hard not to take up too much space. Who exactly are they? Margaret asked, pointing a finger. Family, Rose said simply. Margaret looked at them again. She watched the way Marcos gently held the heavy door open for an elderly man. Man isn't just a nice story? Henry, Rose said firmly, leaning in. I have using a walker. She watched the way Anna had immediately, instinctively sat right down beside an old woman who was sitting all alone at a table and just started chatting with her like they were old friends. Chosen family, Margaret observed astutely. The absolute best kind to have, Rose agreed. Margaret nodded her head slowly in approval. She sat down at the table. She folded her neat hands on the tabletop in the exact way of a strong woman who has always run the important meetings. All right, Margaret commanded. Tell me exactly what you're thinking. Henry literally laughed out loud when Rose told him the plan. It was not the small, polite, fake laugh of someone just trying to be agreeable. It was the real laugh, big and warm and completely unself-conscious. It was the exact laugh she had discovered in their very first conversation weeks ago. The laugh that had told her immediately everything she ever needed to know about who this man was inside. A real home? Henry asked, wiping his eyes. With a real garden? With a proper, big garden, Rose confirmed. One that we can actually go out into and use every day. and we would actually have a say in how the place runs? That is the idea, yes. He laughed again, out of pure shock. Then he suddenly stopped laughing and looked at her very seriously. Do you really mean this? He asked softly. You're not just saying this to be nice. This he never once in my entire life said something nice that I didn't completely mean. He looked at her honest face for a long moment. My own son hasn't called me on the phone in 4 months, he said sadly. I know, she whispered. I used to have a huge vegetable garden at my old house, he said, his eyes lighting up with the memory. I grew big tomatoes, spicy peppers, 3 different kinds of green beans. He turned and looked out the dirty window at the struggling, sad rose bushes. I would really like to grow things in the dirt again. Before I die. Then we will make absolutely sure there is plenty of space for it, Rose promised him. Henry looked down at his large, old, empty hands. Then he looked back up at her, grinning. I am in, he declared. They ended up staying at Sunrise Care for 3 whole hours that day. By the time they finally left the building, they had spoken privately to 11 different residents. Not all of them could come to the new home. Some of them genuinely needed intense medical levels of care that a normal home simply couldn't provide safely. But 8 of them, including Tiny Dorothy and Strict Margaret and Loud Henry, lit up from the inside. They lit up in a very particular, beautiful way that broken people light up when something they had completely stopped allowing themselves to ever hope for suddenly becomes a real possibility. On the walk back out to the parking lot, Anna was completely quiet for a long time. Then she gently took Rose's arm. Dorothy, Anna whispered, her voice choked up. When you told her the news, did you see her face change? Yes, Rose smiled. She completely stopped watching the front door, Anna said, wiping a tear. Just for a little while. She actually stopped watching for her terrible daughter, and she was just sitting there present with us in the moment. Yes, Rose said softly. Anna was quiet again. They walked a little further across the hot asphalt. We are really doing this, Anna stated. It was not a question. It was a massive realization finally landing in her heart. We are really doing this, Rose confirmed. Exactly 3 weeks later, the shiny black Mercedes finally appeared on the street. Rose was out in the front garden of the small yellow house. She and Anna had been working hard on it together, slowly turning the overgrown, messy patch of weeds into something real. Something with order and bright color and clear intention. She was down on her knees in the dark soil, wearing her thick gardening gloves, when she clearly heard the car engine. She didn't even need to look up to know who it was. She knew the exact purring sound of that expensive engine. She had heard it pulling into the gravel driveway of the house with the green door for years and years. She slowly sat back on her heels. She pulled off her dirty gloves. She stood up very slowly, calmly brushing the loose soil from the front of her dress, and she turned around. The black Mercedes was parked right at the curb. All 3 car doors popped open at the exact same time. Robert climbed out from the driver's side. Sandra stepped out from the passenger seat. Benjamin slowly unfolded his long legs from the back seat. They were all dressed very well. Robert was wearing his expensive, crisp work shirt. Sandra had her hair professionally done. Even Benjamin actually looked like he had made a real effort to look presentable today. They stood there together on the concrete pavement and just looked at her over the fence. And she stood perfectly still at the garden gate and just looked back at them. Nobody moved an inch for a long moment. Then Robert smiled. It was the big, warm, highly practiced smile that had always been his absolute best performance in life. Mom, he called out warmly, opening his arms wide. We have been so worried about you. Rose just looked at her eldest son. She stood there and thought about the blue nursing home van. She thought about Sandra's icy cool fingers. She thought about the open kitchen window and the cruel words she was not supposed to have overheard. She thought about $20 million just sitting in a bank account for 3 years and a thick stack of certified letters signed for and purposely hidden away in the dark. She absolutely did not move 1 step toward him. Robert, she said flatly. He kept his big fake smile up, but something visibly shifted behind his eyes. A slight, nervous uncertainty. It was the look of a confident man who has rehearsed a scene in his head and suddenly isn't sure the other. Actor is going to follow the script. Why don't we all just go inside the house? Sandra suggested smoothly, looking right past Rose at the faded yellow building. Her sharp accountant's eyes were already moving, calculating, assessing the property value. We have a whole lot to catch up on, Sandra added. Yes, said Rose coldly. We certainly do. She unlatched and opened the wooden gate. She turned and led them inside the house without rushing at all. This slow pace was highly deliberate on her part. Rose had learned over 70 years of life that the person who moves slowly in a tense, nervous situation is always the person who holds the real power in the room. She walked steadily up the front garden path at her own exact pace, opened the blue front door, and stepped inside without even looking back to see if they were following her. They were following. She could easily hear their different footsteps right behind her. Robert's heavy, confident stride. Sandra's sharp heels clicking on the path. Benjamin's slightly dragging, shuffling walk. She could also clearly hear them taking in the details of the house as they walked. The small, hesitant adjustments in their footsteps that meant they were looking around at the walls, assessing everything they saw. She led them straight into the sitting room. It was a very modest room. It held Marcos and Anna's simple furniture, which was worn soft in the highly comfortable way of things that had been genuinely used and loved. There were fresh, bright flowers sitting on the windowsill that Rose had personally cut from the garden just that morning. There was a framed photograph resting on the wooden shelf that Anna had proudly put there 2 weeks ago. It was a picture of the four of them, Rose and Anthony and Marcos and Anna. It had been taken out in the garden on a lazy Sunday afternoon when Anthony had been having a very good health day and the sunlight was kind and golden. Sandra immediately saw the photograph. Rose saw Sandra. See it. Her eyes narrowed. Sit down, Rose commanded, pointing to the seats. They sat. Robert and Sandra took the larger sofa. Benjamin sank into the armchair in the corner, immediately arranging his body with the lazy ease of someone settling in for a very comfortable, long visit. Rose sat down perfectly straight in the upright wooden chair directly across from them. It was the chair that had become, completely without anyone officially designating it as such, her specific chair in this house. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. She waited in silence. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Mom, he began in his serious voice. I really want you to know, we have been worried sick about you guys. When we finally found out you had left the care facility, that you just walked right out the door in the middle of the night, before dawn, Rose corrected him flatly. Sorry? Robert blinked. We left the building before dawn, Rose stated clearly. Not in the middle of the night. Before dawn. There was a small, uncomfortable pause in the room. The point is, Robert continued, recovering smoothly and recalibrating his tone. We didn't know where you were at all. We called the facility management, and they said you were just completely gone. With Dad's heart condition, literally anything could have happened out there on the streets. Something did happen out there, Rose said calmly. Your father had a serious cardiac event right on the side of the blazing hot highway. He had to spend 2 full nights admitted in the hospital. The room went dead quiet. Benjamin shifted uncomfortably in his armchair. We totally didn't know that happened, Sandra said quickly. Her voice had something fake in it. Exactly the right amount of distress, carefully measured out for effect. If we had known you were in the hospital, you would have called us. Rose cut her off. Sandra opened her mouth to argue. You had the facility's direct phone number, Rose pointed out pleasantly. You are the ones who put us in there. You easily could have called the front desk at any time during those 2 awful weeks just to check whether we were still alive. She said it very pleasantly, exactly the way you state a simple, boring fact about the weather. You didn't call us once. Nobody in the room had an answer for that. Just then, the front door rattled open. Marcos came walking in first. He was still wearing his dirty garage work clothes, wiping grease off his hands with a stained cloth. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the 3 fancy visitors sitting in his living room. Something dark flashed across his face. It was a lightning-quick reading of the room's energy that took him less than 2 seconds to process. And then he just nodded his head tightly and moved to stand firmly near the doorway, deliberately choosing not to sit down. Anna came walking in right behind him. She was carrying heavy bags of groceries. She stopped in the narrow hallway, looked through the sitting room door at the strangers, and then carefully set the grocery bags down on the floor. She walked in and came to stand right beside Marcos. The three children stared at them in confusion. "Who are these people?" Robert asked, frowning. "This is Marcos." Rose introduced them calmly. "And this is Anna. This is their private home. Anthony and I live here with them now." "You live here?" Sandra repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Yes, I live here with strangers with my new family," Rose said, looking right at her daughter. "The exact same way I once lived with you." Sandra's fake expression flickered and broke for a second. Anna caught Rose's eye from a doorway. Rose gave her the smallest possible nod of permission. Anna turned and went straight into the kitchen. From the hallway, a few minutes later, came the loud, normal sound of the metal kettle filling with water and the completely ordinary domestic sounds of someone preparing a tray of tea. The absolute, jarring normalness of it set in. Stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating tension inside the sitting room was, Rose thought to herself, exactly the right move. Anthony suddenly appeared at the sitting room door. He moved very slowly, leaning heavily on his wooden stick. He stopped and stood right in the doorway, blocking the exit. He looked at his three grown children sitting on the sofa with an expression that was totally impossible for them to read. It was not an angry look. It was not a wounded, sad look. It was something way beyond both of those petty things. It was something that had already passed completely through the hot anger and the deep grief and had finally come out on the other side into a kind of crystal clear, still, absolute knowing. "Dad!" Robert exclaimed, jumping up. He crossed the small room quickly and tried to wrap his arms around his father in a big embrace. Anthony just let him do it. He stood perfectly rigid with his son's arms wrapped tightly around him, and he just looked right over Robert's shoulder at Rose. Rose looked right back at him. Neither of them needed to say a single word. Robert finally stepped back awkwardly. "You look really well, Dad," he said, sounding genuinely surprised by the fact. "I am much better," Anthony stated coldly. He moved slowly into the room and sat down in the empty chair right beside Rose's chair. Marcos instantly moved a small footstool into position nearby, without even being asked to do it. Anthony nodded at Marcos briefly, in the quiet way of two men who deeply understand each other's actions. Robert watched this small, intimate exchange with narrow eyes. "So," Anthony said loudly, breaking the silence, "you finally came." "Of course we came," Sandra said defensively. "You are our parents." "Yes," Anthony replied dryly. "We are." Another heavy silence fell. Benjamin, Rose noticed, had said almost nothing at all since they arrived at the house. He just sat slumped in the armchair, constantly staring at the framed photograph on the wooden shelf with a weird expression she hadn't seen on his face in many years. She wasn't totally sure what the emotion was yet. She filed the observation away in her mind for later. Robert crossed his legs and settled back deep into the sofa cushions, using the practiced gesture of a businessman who has decided to completely change his negotiation approach. "We want you both to come back home with us," Robert declared smoothly. "This right here is our home now," Rose countered immediately. "Mom, please be serious for a minute," Robert sighed. "This." He vaguely gestured his hand around at the small, modest room. "Careful," Marcos warned from the doorway. His voice was very quiet, but incredibly level and dangerous. Robert snapped his head to look at the mechanic. He gave Marcos a quick, insulting assessment. The exact arrogant way Robert looked at everyone in the world, measuring their worth, categorizing their income. "I meant absolutely no offense to you," Robert said dismissively. "Then be very careful not to give any offense in my house," Marcos replied without blinking. Another silence stretched out, totally different from the previous ones. This one was sharp. Rose sat and watched Robert adjust his posture. She could clearly see him recalculating his strategy the exact way he always had when a situation wasn't going perfectly according to his master plan. He was always a practical man. He always knew exactly when a position wasn't working, and he always knew how to pivot to the next one. "There are some very important things we need to discuss today," Sandra chimed in, taking over the lead. "As a family, important financial things. She looked nervously at hadn't even waited to finish their tea. She looked right at Sandra's greedy eyes. Go on, Rose challenged her. Sandra straightened her spine slightly. We became aware very recently that there may be some large assets involved. $20 million. Anthony interrupted her flatly. And 10 rental properties across the city. Sandra completely stopped talking. Her mouth hung open. You already know? Robert asked, stunned. We know everything, Anthony confirmed. The room went incredibly still. Then something changed in the air. A very subtle but absolutely unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of the room. It felt exactly like the heavy moment right before a violent storm arrives. The whole fake performance of the concerned, worried children, which had been wearing terribly thin since the moment they walked in the door, just dropped away entirely. It wasn't dramatic. It was just quietly gone, replaced by raw greed. Sandra closed her hands tightly together in her lap. Then you must understand, she said coldly, that this is strictly a family matter. That these assets legally belong to the family. That whatever has happened between us in the past, whatever has happened, Rose repeated, raising an eyebrow. Sandra ignored her and continued pushing forward without pausing. It should absolutely not affect how we handle this money together. As a family unit. As a family, Rose repeated again, tasting the bitter words. She just let the words sit there in the air, rotting. Anna walked in exactly then with a heavy tea tray. She set it down gently on the coffee table between them with a quiet, careful precision that somehow magically managed to feel both highly hospitable and like a massive insult. She poured out 5 cups of tea without bothering to ask how anyone took it, set them down on the saucers, and then calmly went to sit on the wide arm of Marcos's chair. She sat there with the absolute calm power of a woman sitting in her own home who has absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. Nobody reached for the tea. You had the legal letters, Anthony stated bluntly. Sandra snapped her head to look at him. 3 whole years of certified letters sent from the downtown law firm, Anthony continued. Delivered straight to our house. Signed for by you. Hidden away in the dark. His voice was perfectly even and quiet. It was the exact same disappointed voice he had used when their children were very young and had done something terribly wrong, and he needed them to truly understand the heavy weight of their bad actions. Why did you do it? Dad, please. Sandra started to deflect. Not a speech. Sandra, Anthony cut her off sharply. Just give me the real reason. Sandra looked down at her manicured hands. Robert looked out the front window at his fancy car. Benjamin, sitting in the corner, still just stared at the photograph on the shelf. The heavy silence stretched out painfully, and then Benjamin finally spoke up. He didn't even look away from the photograph when he said it. Because we thought you would just give the money away. Everyone in the room turned and looked at him in shock. He finally slowly turned his head away from the photograph. The family, Rose declared strongly. Just not the family, you mean. She told them everything right then. She laid it all out calmly and completely. She told them about the beautiful home she was going to build from the ground up. She told them about the broken people who would come to live inside its safe walls. She told them about old Henry and his big vegetable garden. She told them about tiny Dorothy sitting in her window. She told them about strict Margaret and her straight-backed dignity. All the forgotten ones that nobody was ever coming back for. She carefully watched her children's faces as she spoke the words. Robert's face was totally unreadable. It was the blank expression he always wore when he was rapidly processing something he hadn't anticipated in his business plans. Sandra's face rapidly moved through several different emotions. Frantic calculation, angry dismissal, and a brief, greedy reconsideration. Benjamin just kept looking miserably at the floorboards. When she finally finished explaining the grand plan, Robert spread his hands wide in a fake gesture of peace. Mom, he chuckled nervously. It really is a lovely idea. It truly is. But $20 million it is exactly enough money to do it properly and right. Rose interrupted him flatly. It is your legal inheritance. Sandra burst out angrily. Yours and Dad's. You should be living comfortably. You should have financial security in your old age. You should, Sandra. Anthony's booming voice cut through the room like a knife. She instantly stopped talking. What you should have, Anthony said very slowly, enunciating every single word, is the basic courage to say out loud what you actually came here today to say. Not what you think sounds reasonable to our ears. He glared at his daughter. He really looked deeply at her. It was the long, patient, seeing look of a father who has known a person since long before they even knew themselves. Say it plainly right now, Anthony challenged her. You will feel much better if you do. Sandra stared back at her old father. For one brief moment, just one tiny moment, something vulnerable moved across her face that Rose clearly recognized from a very long time ago. It was from when Sandra was just 7 years old and had broken a nice vase and tried to hide the pieces under the rug, and then simply couldn't carry the heavy weight of the lie anymore. But she was definitely not 7 years old anymore. The softness vanished. The moment passed. We want our fair share of the money, Sandra stated flatly and coldly. That is exactly what we came here to say today. I know you do. Anthony nodded sadly. And? Sandra demanded. And absolutely nothing, Anthony said firmly. You get nothing today. He slowly reached down for his wooden walking stick. He began to stand up. Marcos moved slightly forward to help him, but Anthony firmly shook his head no. He desperately wanted to do this part completely by himself. He stood up to his full height, which was still quite considerable in the small room, and he looked down at his 3 grown children sitting there. You will all hear from our lawyer downtown, Anthony announced. There are some minor legal things to resolve, and they will be resolved properly and legally and completely without any shouting. He paused and gripped his stick tightly. But I really want you to understand something very clearly before you walk out that door. Nobody in the room moved an inch. I built a beautiful house for this family with my own 2 bare hands, Anthony stated, his voice vibrating with emotion. I worked out there in the heat every single weekend for 3 years straight. I missed parties and family holidays and basic rest. I did all of that because I truly believe that what you build for the people you love is the absolute best thing you can ever do with your time on this earth. He was totally quiet for a heavy moment. You took that house from me, he said softly. Fine. Wood and brick houses can easily be replaced. He looked at them, one by one, piercing them with his stare. But you also took 2 old people who loved you, and you drove them out and left them on a burning road to die alone. And for that specific action, I do not have a word in the dictionary strong enough to describe it. The room was absolutely, suffocatingly silent. You can all go now, Anthony commanded. Robert stood up first. He nervously straightened the collar of his expensive shirt. He looked around the small room one more time. He looked at Marcos, standing like a guard in the doorway. He looked at Anna, sitting casually on the arm of the chair. He looked at the framed photograph sitting on the shelf. He looked at the fresh flowers Rose had cut that morning, taking his mental inventory, as always, calculating the angles. Then he finally looked at his mother, and for just one brief moment, a single, unguarded, raw moment that came and went so incredibly quickly that Rose almost missed seeing it. But she saw it. She saw the little boy who used to run and bring her crushed wildflowers from the empty dirt lot at the very end of their old street. The little boy who used to fall sound asleep at the wooden kitchen table doing his math homework while she cooked dinner. The child who had been, once upon a time, long before something inside him hardened into the cold man, standing here right now. A sweet child who truly loved her. She saw that ghost, and then it was gone behind the wall. We will be in touch, Robert said formally. His voice was totally steady and businesslike. He turned and walked straight to the front door. Sandra quickly stood up and followed him without speaking a word. She did not look at Rose's face. She did not look at Anthony's face. She just walked out with her chin slightly raised in the air and her cold eyes staring straight forward. It was the exact same arrogant way she had walked through absolutely every single difficulty in her entire life, acting as though. Completely refusing to acknowledge a terrible thing was the exact same thing as being morally above it. Benjamin was the last one to leave. He got up very slowly from the deep armchair. He was the only one of the 3 who actually stopped walking. He physically stopped right in the middle of the small room and turned back around to face them. He looked directly at his mother's tired eyes. "Mom," he whispered. Rose just looked back at her youngest child. "I am so sorry," he said. "It was just that." Small and insufficient, but somehow completely true. Rose studied his face for a very long moment. "I know you are," she finally said. It was definitely not total forgiveness. It was not a door swinging open to welcome him back, but it was the honest truth. And Benjamin seemed to fully understand that it was the absolute most she could ever offer him right now, because he just nodded his head once, turned around, and walked out the door. The blue front door clicked closed behind him. Through the sitting room window, Rose stood and watched the shiny black Mercedes pull slowly away from the curb. She watched it move smoothly down the quiet street, turn the corner at the end of the block, and completely disappear from sight. Then she let out a massive breath and sat back down heavily in her chair. The whole room seemed to finally breathe again. Anna quietly stood up, picked up the tray of totally untouched teacups, and carried them into the kitchen without saying a single word. Marcos walked over and sat down heavily on the sofa, exactly where Robert and Sandra had just been sitting. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at Anthony. "Are you all right, sir?" Marcos asked gently. "Yes," Anthony sighed, leaning on his stick. He slowly lowered himself back down into his own chair. He looked incredibly tired, but he did not look broken at all. It was the good kind of tiredness. The deep tiredness of someone who has just done something incredibly hard and necessary, rather than something that has defeated them. "You did very well," Marcos offered. Anthony looked over at him. "You think so?" "I think you said exactly what desperately needed to be said." Marcos nodded. "And you said it standing up like a man." Anthony considered this compliment. "Yes," he agreed finally. "I suppose I did." Rose reached her hand across the space and put it gently over his hand. He slowly turned his rough palm up and held her fingers tight. The senior lawyer's name was James Henry. He was the actual senior partner of the big firm, not the nervous young man in the too-warm suit who had come to the house. He was about 60 years old, with a very quiet, highly precise manner about him. He had the kind of calm, lined face that had clearly heard way too many crazy human stories over his long career to ever be surprised by any of them. He sat in his big leather chair and listened carefully to absolutely everything they told him. Then he spent 3 full days meticulously reviewing all the documents, the postal delivery records, and the dates of the signatures. At the end of those 3 days, he called Rose and Anthony back down to his nice office and laid the whole situation out simply and clearly. The certified letters have been legally delivered and officially signed for over a continuous period of 31 months. Every single one of the signatures on the receipts belonged to Sandra. There was a very clear, highly documented, undeniable pattern of active concealment that had materially and illegally delayed Anthony's rightful access to his grandfather's inheritance. "This is entirely actionable in court," Mr. Henry stated unambiguously, tapping the file. "We do not want to pursue criminal charges against them," Rose said firmly. The lawyer looked at her in surprise. "Mrs. Walker, you must understand, we just want it fully documented," Anthony interrupted calmly. "We want the absolute truth on the official record. But we absolutely do not want to spend years in courtrooms and trials and endless fighting." He paused and looked at his wife. "We are old people. We simply do not have years left to spend on that kind of negativity." Mr. Henry nodded his head slowly, understanding their position. "Then what exactly do you want me to do?" he asked. "We want the new will prepared properly right now," Rose declared. "While we're still here and can do it clearly and legally and completely without any room for them to challenge it later on in court." She folded her hands tightly on the polished mahogany desk. "And we want to say exactly what we have decided it should say. That I can absolutely do for you," Mr. Henry promised. It took exactly 6 whole weeks to finally set everything in motion. 6 busy weeks of downtown meetings and signing thick stacks of documents and making huge decisions. Weeks of walking through dusty, empty properties with Marcos pointing out structural issues. Weeks of sitting closely with Anthony in the quiet evenings, poring over hand-drawn blueprints and floor plans. Weeks of long phone calls with Anna about all the specific things a real, true home would actually need to function well. Brupe, masiva kishin. A backyard big enough to hold all of old Henry's vegetable dreams. Bedrooms with large windows that could actually open up to let the fresh breeze blow in. They finally found the perfect property on a rainy Wednesday morning. Marcos drove them all to go see it. It was a very large, beautiful older house situated on a wide, quiet street, set far back from the road behind a huge garden that had sadly gone completely wild with years of neglect. It had 8 big bedrooms. It had a gorgeous kitchen that Rose walked right into and instantly felt completely at home in. It had a massive sitting room with a real stone fireplace. And it had a backyard garden that stretched back far enough to hold absolutely whatever Henry ever wanted to grow in the dirt. It needed a lot of work, though. Real, serious construction work. The plaster walls needed patching and repainting. The slate roof needed serious attention to fix leaks. The wild garden desperately needed someone to take it seriously and tame the weeds. Marcos walked slowly through the empty rooms with his sharp builder's eyes constantly moving, noting things down on his phone screen, calculating costs and timelines quietly in his head. 6 months of hard work, he finally announced. Maybe 5 months if we really push the crews hard. Push them hard, Rose ordered without hesitation. Marcos smiled a wide grin. Yes, ma'am, he saluted. Anthony stood right in the exact middle of what would soon become the main sitting room. He slowly turned around in a circle, taking in the grand proportions of the space. The soaring high ceilings, the tall, beautiful windows that let the golden morning light fall perfectly across the scuffed old floorboards. It is a very good house, Anthony judged. It will be, Rose corrected him. He looked over at her affectionately. It already is a good house, he smiled. It just needs good people living in it. The heavy building work officially began in the early spring. Marcos personally managed every detail of it. He showed up at the site long before the loud contractors arrived in the mornings, and he stayed there working long after they had all packed up and left for the night. He did all the difficult things himself that he could physically do himself, meticulously saving their money wherever it could safely be saved, and brilliantly organized absolutely everything else. The city registrations, the health and safety approvals, the small mountain of frustrating paperwork that inevitably comes with legally turning a private house into a registered care home for multiple elderly people. Rose and Anthony came by the site every single week to proudly check on the progress. There was one specific moment. It was on a sunny Tuesday morning in late spring. The sharp, fresh smell of new paint was hanging in the air, and the loud sound of hammering was coming from upstairs, and the wild garden was already beginning to be beautifully tamed. Anthony suddenly stopped walking in the main hallway. He reached out and placed his big, rough hand flat against the wall, just his open palm, pressing flat against the fresh, smooth plaster. Rose stopped walking right beside him. She didn't need to ask him what he was doing. She knew exactly what it was. It was the unconscious gesture of a proud builder feeling the solid strength of something he was a part of bringing to life. It was the exact same gesture he had made 50 long years ago, standing proudly inside the walls of the little house on Maple Street. His old hands still remembered how to do it. They officially decided to call it Rose House. It was actually Anna's beautiful idea. She happily announced it one evening while they were all sitting around the kitchen table. She said it in the exact way she announced most things in life, directly and completely, exactly as though the perfect name had always existed in the universe, and she had simply been the one to locate it. Rose House, Anna declared proudly. Marcos looked at Rose in surprise. Rose looked at Anthony. That is way too much attention on me, Rose protested softly. It is exactly right, Anna insisted stubbornly. It is named for the brilliant person who originally thought of the whole idea. And it is named for the wild garden out front. And it is named for the beautiful rose bushes we're going to plant all along the wooden fence. She looked at Rose very steadily with her dark eyes. All 3 meanings at once. It is absolutely perfect. Rose opened her mouth to argue some more. She is right. Anthony interrupted her gently. Rose looked over at him. She usually is right, he added with a wink, which earned him a truly delighted, beaming smile from Anna, and a stern look from Rose that he completely pretended not to notice at all. Rose's house it was. Old Henry was the very first person to move in. He officially moved in on a bright Friday morning. He arrived in Marcos's car with exactly one battered suitcase and one small cardboard box completely full of seeds. Tomato seeds, pepper seeds, 3 different kinds of green bean seeds. Exactly as he had described that day at the facility. He walked proudly through the newly painted front door, walked straight through the house, and out into the backyard garden. He just stood there on the grass for a very long time, simply looking at the massive space of it, taking in the absolute, beautiful possibility of the rich dirt before he did absolutely anything else. Marcos walked out and stood quietly beside him. "Where exactly would you like to start?" Marcos asked respectfully. Henry slowly raised a shaking finger and pointed over to the far back corner of the yard, where the golden sun fell the absolute longest during the day. "Right over there," Henry declared. "Then, that is exactly where we will start digging," Marcos smiled. They both walked over to the shed to get the heavy shovels. Tiny Dorothy moved in the very following week. She brought almost absolutely nothing with her. Just one small canvas bag, a soft knitted cardigan, and one framed photograph of a much younger version of herself. In the picture, she was standing proudly in front of a house, smiling brightly in a way that perfectly contained everything she had ever been before the endless waiting had started. Anna gently walked her upstairs and showed her to her new private room. It had a huge window, and it absolutely did not overlook a gray asphalt car park. It looked directly out onto the beautiful green back garden. Dorothy stood perfectly still at that window for a very long time. She looked down at old Henry, who was already happily working in the dirt in his sunny corner. She looked at the new, bright rose bushes beginning to firmly establish their roots all along the wooden fence. She looked up at the wide, clear, blue sky spreading above it all. Then she slowly turned around to face Anna. "This would do nicely," Dorothy said very quietly. It was, Anna told Rose much later that night while crying, the absolute most beautiful thing she had heard a person say in a very long time. Strict Margaret arrived last of the original 3 friends. Characteristically, she was highly organized for the move. She brought 2 perfectly packed suitcases, a heavy box full of classic books, and a neatly typed list of practical suggestions for the daily running of the new house. She formally presented this list to Rose in the hallway with the brisk, absolute confidence of someone who knows for a fact that her expertise is genuine and is absolutely not going to pretend otherwise to be polite. Rose calmly took the list from her hand. She put on her glasses and read it very carefully from top to bottom. "Most of this is exactly right," Rose judged. "All of it is right," Margaret corrected her without missing a beat. "There are 1 or 2 minor things I would definitely do differently," Rose noted. "I would be highly interested to hear which ones those are," Margaret challenged her. They went into the kitchen and sat down at the big wooden table for a whole hour, going through every bullet point together. Rose and this retired, stubborn schoolteacher. 2 old, wise women with very strong opinions and decades of accumulated, hard-earned knowledge between them. They were building something incredibly useful out of the powerful combination of their minds. By the end of the long hour, they had completely agreed on almost everything on the paper. "You would have made a very good school teacher," Margaret noted approvingly. "You would have been very good at whatever you set your stubborn mind to," Rose countered with a smile. Margaret considered this compliment very seriously. "Yes," she finally agreed. "I suppose I would have been." By the end of the very first year of operation, Rose House officially had 9 full-time residents living there. 9 human beings who had been cruelly set aside by their own families, who had selfishly decided they were completely finished dealing with them. 9 people who had previously sat rotting in sterile facilities or all alone in dark rooms, just desperately waiting for something good that was never going to come. But now, they all woke up in the mornings to the wonderful smell of Rose's fresh cooking drifting up the stairs. They sat outside in Henry's blooming garden on the good, sunny days. They loudly and happily argued about what shows to watch on the big television in the evenings. They actually knew each other's names and personal histories and the very particular, specific way each person preferred to take their hot tea. They were, in the absolute most specific and unambiguous sense of the word, finally home. Anthony's health moved in the exact, unpredictable way that old age usually moves. It did not go in a straight, steady line, but in rising and falling waves. There were wonderful months of truly good days when he sat out in the garden and talked for hours to Henry about tools, and walked slowly around the neighborhood block with Rose in the early morning air, and seemed completely against all reasonable medical expectation to actually be getting much better. And then there were the much harder months, the painful months. Rose faithfully stayed right beside his bed through absolutely all of it. That was what she had always done for him, and what she would always continue to do. She had absolutely not changed in this core part of herself. If anything at all, the passing years had only made her much more fiercely certain of it. It was the way long, dedicated practice makes a hard thing feel not like awful effort, but like it is simply who you are inside. She sat with him in the quiet mornings with their cups of tea. She gently combed his white hair the exact way he liked it parted. She tightly held his hand across the small gap in the dark bedroom when his heart hurt and he couldn't sleep. She finally told him, on one of the very hardest, darkest nights, about the one true thing she had never actually told him before. She told him that in all the long years of their marriage, through absolutely all the pain and the struggle and the heartbreak, she had never once regretted a single day she spent with him. He was very quiet for a long moment after she said this. Not even the really bad ones? He asked in a whisper. The bad ones are just a part of the whole beautiful thing, she answered softly. You cannot take them out. It is all one big thing. He thought deeply about this concept. I want to tell you something now, he said. Tell me, she whispered, that awful morning out on the hot road, when you bravely held out your arm at the rushing traffic. He paused to catch his breath. I was sitting there watching you from the concrete barrier, and I thought to myself, even right then, even in that terrifying moment, that you were absolutely the bravest person I had ever seen in my entire life. Rose looked up at the dark ceiling. I was absolutely terrified out there, she admitted. I know you were. He smiled weakly in the dark. That is exactly what made it so brave. Anthony finally died on a quiet Thursday morning in early autumn. He died peacefully in his own bed in Rose's house, right in the beautiful room with a large window that looked directly out onto the blooming garden. The little lemon tree that Anna had originally planted in the small yard of the yellow house had been carefully dug up and transplanted here, to a much better spot with far more sunlight. And it had flourished and grown in a way that seemed almost intentional and deliberate, exactly as though it had been patiently waiting for the right place to put down roots all along. He died with Rose sitting right beside him holding his hand, and with Marcos and Anna standing quietly in the room. The soothing sound of the garden breeze was coming through the open window. They could hear old Henry's booming voice somewhere out there in the yard, happily talking to his tomato plants the exact way he always did. He died very peacefully. He died exactly as he had always wanted to die. He died a free man. The final legal will was officially read 3 weeks later. Mr. Henry read it aloud in his downtown office, quietly and completely without any dramatic flair, exactly the way Anthony had strictly wanted everything done at the end. All the residential rental properties and their steady monthly income legally went directly to a trust for Rose House in perpetuity. It was more than enough money to comfortably run the home for as long as it was ever needed, which is to say, forever, because the desperate need for such safe places in the world absolutely does not ever end. The remainder of the huge pile of liquid cash assets was equally divided between Rose, for her lifetime use, and Marcos and Anna. The thing you gave me, nothing. The single dollar is only included so you cannot ever try to say you were simply forgotten in this will. I definitely remembered you. In fact, I thought about you every single day. But human love that is not returned must eventually be redirected toward those people who can actually receive it. I truly hope that one day, before you die, you finally understand the massive difference between a family you are merely born into and a family you actively choose to build. The first one I freely gave you. The second one you threw away like trash. Signed, Anthony. The law office was deathly silent when Mr. Henry finished reading the harsh words. Robert sat frozen, very still in his chair. Sandra stared blankly at the large window. Benjamin just stared down at the polished wooden table. None of them spoke a single word for a very long time. Then Benjamin slowly put his face down in his hands. Whether he was actually crying tears or simply completely overwhelmed by the shame of it all, Rose really couldn't tell. And she absolutely didn't stay in a room to find out. She calmly stood up from her chair, politely thanked Mr. Henry for his hard work, and walked straight out into the crisp autumn morning air. Marcos was already waiting outside by the curb with the car. Anna was standing right there with him. Their shoulders were touching in the highly comfortable, easy way of two people who have perfectly learned the exact shape of each other's hearts. Rose stood there on the busy pavement for a long moment and just felt the cool autumn air and the warm sun shining on her face. She felt the very particular, beautiful quality of the day. It was so ordinary and so absolutely extraordinary at the exact same time. The way all normal days truly are when you have finally learned how to look at them properly. She thought of Anthony. She thought of him standing proudly inside the unfinished house on Maple Street with wet green, paint smeared on his big hands. She thought of him tightly holding her hand across the dark gap in that terrible facility. She thought of his old palm pressing flat against the fresh plaster wall of Rose's house, feeling the solid strength of something truly worth building. She thought to herself, he is still right here. He is here in absolutely everything we made together. That thought was enough for her. It was more than enough. It was everything in the world. She slowly got into the back seat of the car. Ready? Marcos asked gently, looking in the mirror. Rose looked out the window at the tall glass law firm building one last time. Then she turned her head to face forward. Take me home, she smiled. And he did. Rose lived happily for 7 more years after that. They were, by absolutely any measure in the world, very good years. Full, rich years. Years full of hot morning tea and hard garden work in the sun, and stubborn arguments with Margaret about the absolute best way to run the daily schedule. Years of long, laughing evenings sitting at the big kitchen table with Marcos and Anna and whoever else happened to be visiting that day. Rose's house successfully grew larger. A second big property was officially added to the trust in the 3rd year. It was another beautiful old house located on a wider street nearby. It had enough room for 12 more abandoned residents to live safely. In the 5th year of operation, a wonderful large community garden was officially opened on the grounds. It was old Henry's special project. It had magically grown way beyond his sunny little corner into something huge that the whole entire neighborhood started coming to visit and working on the weekends. The original chipped green door from the old house on Maple Street was unfortunately never recovered from the greedy children. But the solid front door of Rose's house was happily painted, in the very first week of opening, a very particular bright shade of green. Rose had specifically chosen the exact paint color. Herself, at the hardware store. Anna had asked her why she wanted that specific color. It reminds me of home, Rose had answered simply. Anna had looked at the painted door, and then at Rose's smiling face, and had understood the meaning immediately. The exact way she usually understood all important things, completely, without ever needing it explained to her out loud. When Rose finally died peacefully in her sleep, she legally left absolutely everything she had left to the Rose House Trust. In her own final letter, which the older Mr. Henry read aloud in the exact same quiet downtown office on a cold winter morning, with Marcos and Anna and strict Margaret and old Henry and tiny Dorothy and all the others gathered closely around listening, she had written only this short message. A home is never just a brick building. A home is exactly what happens between people who actively choose to show up for each other every single day. I was beautifully shown this fact very late in my life by the wonderful people sitting in this room right now, and it was the absolute greatest gift I ever received on this earth. Please give it to someone else who needs it. That is all I ask of you. They did. They always did. I really hope you enjoyed watching and listening to this story today as much as I deeply enjoyed creating it for you. Please remember to hit the like button, share this video with your family and friends, and leave a comment below on the important life lessons you've learned from Rose and Anthony's journey. Let me know exactly where you're watching from in the comments below, because we love reading them. See you all in my next video.